Heavenly Father, today we put on the full armor to protect us against attack. We put on the belt of truth to protect against lies and deception. We put on the breastplate of righteousness to protect our hearts from the temptations. We put the gospel of peace on our feet to walk in your light, peace, and freedom with the Holy Spirit. We rebuke anxious thoughts. We take up your shield of faith for protection to block and destroy all the darts and threats thrown at us by the enemy. We put on the helmet of salvation to cover our minds and thoughts, reminding us that we are children of a mighty King. We are forgiven, set free, saved by the blood of Jesus. We take up the sword of the Spirit, your living word, that has the power to demolish strongholds and is sharper than any double-edged sword. We come to you, Lord, in prayer daily. In Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
What's up, you guys? Welcome to The Imagination. I'm your host, Emma, and today I'm honored to have back on the show podcast regular, ritual abuse, child trafficking, and governmental mind control survivor, overcomer, and whistleblower, loving mother, artist and visionary, entrepreneur, podcast host, and creator of her own incredible educational and informative YouTube channel at Desert Dakini, Carrie Olaje. From the shadows of unimaginable darkness, Carrie emerged as a radiant symbol of hope, strength, and unyielding courage. A survivor of child trafficking, satanic ritual abuse, and monarch mind control programming, Carrie's journey is a testament to the indomitable human spirit, a story that captivates the heart and inspires the soul. Born into a world where her innocence was stolen, Carrie survived horrors most cannot fathom. From the time she was a small child, she endured orchestrated abuse designed to fracture her psyche, creating a complex internal system of dissociative parts to cope with the horrors. These parts, born from betrayal and trauma, were molded into roles she's mentioned on past episodes: soldiers, priestesses, even mythical creatures like unicorns, through meticulously crafted and sophisticated programming methods and ritualistic abuse. Yet within this darkness, Carrie found a spark of defiance. She refused to let her abusers define her, embarking on a courageous journey to reclaim her identity. With unwavering determination, she began the arduous process of reclaiming her life, piecing together fragmented memories and healing wounds that ran deeper than the eye could see. And now and today, we get the honor of learning how she did it. Through her own YouTube channel at Desert Dakini, which I highly encourage you guys to go subscribe to, Carrie transforms the incomprehensible into the accessible, using vivid visuals and heartfelt storytelling to demystify DID. Her mission is, and always has been, to offer survivors a lifeline and allies a window into the complex world of trauma-based mind control programming. With every video, she breaks down the mechanics of dissociation, fear, survival, loyalty, and healing into digestible lessons, empowering others to navigate their own paths to recovery. Her artistry, both in her words and her visual presentations, turns pain into beauty, creating safe spaces for healing and self-discovery. On Carrie's last episode on this podcast, we dove deep into the topic of DID, offering a glimpse into the world of deliberate dissociation and operational programming and the complexities of systems and parts that are the means to an end of the types of intense and extreme childhood trauma and abuse victims like Carrie survived. Carrie gave so much important and applicable information in that last episode, and I highly encourage you guys to go back and watch that video, along with a plethora of amazing information she has on her own YouTube channel. On today's episode, Carrie will be diving even deeper into the world of dissociation and DID, with discussions around systems and parts and their roles and functions, geometry and structure that a survivor may encounter when healing a programmed inner world, navigating self-harm and self-elimination programming, and so much more. Carrie's ability to articulate the chaos of DID with clarity and compassion has made her a beacon of hope and inspiration for survivors and a teacher for those seeking to understand. From podcast appearances to her videos on her own channel, she fearlessly shares her truth and the truth, honoring those who didn't survive and lighting the way for those still fighting. Carrie's courage is matched only by her compassion. She dedicates every moment of her spare time to helping others heal, offering a lifeline to those still trapped in the darkness. Her advocacy is a powerful force, shining a light on the hidden evils of organized trafficking and abuse, while inspiring survivors to rise above their past. Carrie is more than a survivor. She is a walking miracle, a force of nature who transforms pain into purpose. Her story is proof that no matter how deep the trauma, healing is possible, and that every single survivor carries the power to rewrite their own narrative. Before wrapping up the introduction of today's guest, I'd like to share just a couple quick reminders and updates. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, if you wanted to share any information privately with me, or if you were interested in submitting a written testimony to be featured in a Substack article, you can reach out to me via email at imagineabetterworld2020@gmail.com or standbysurvivors@protonmail.com. Additionally, I've teamed up with a couple of my favorite brands to offer you guys exclusive discount codes on products I love, such as Rife Technology frequency machines and CZTL's premium methylene blue. You can find all the relevant links and codes along with other resources down below in the show notes. I've also started up a new YouTube channel recently, and you can subscribe to me there at the handle at Imagination Podcast Official. And I'm now streaming new episode premieres from every single week. You can turn on your notifications and join our loving community in the live chats every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday evenings at 6 p.m. Central Time. Thank you all on the other side of the screen wholeheartedly for helping to make the imagination the safest space on the internet for survivor, whistleblower, advocate, and educator disclosures. Your support means the absolute world to me and to every guest on this show. So you guys, without further ado, please help me in welcoming back today's guest of honor, voice for the voiceless, walking miracle, podcast host and content creator, woman of God, anti-child abuse and survivor advocate, creative artist, overcomer, fierce mama bear, and a brilliant, bold, and absolutely inspiring force to be reckoned with, the one, the only, Carrie Olaje. Carrie, thank you so much for being here with us today. It's such an honor to have you back.
Thank you so much, Emma. I am always looking forward to our conversations. Like you are such an inspiration and, you're a total like powerhouse when it comes to, helping to push this awareness further, with survivors and with advocates and everything, allies, random people that are just finally like looking into the issue. It's like it's groundbreaking and it's just it's inspiring. And I said before, like you're totally a huge inspiration to me. I would not have my channel if I hadn't, first like started, following you and then, being a part of your podcast. So, it really gave me, you know, it and really gave me the encouragement that I needed to kind of actually, solidify my hopes, for a channel into an actual thing that, is really, it's a huge part of my healing and staying focused on moving forward and staying productive. And it's also just feels like a way to give back to the survivor community. So, I'm happy to be here once again. And I will, try and make all of the explanation of stuff, palatable and something that's like going to actually help people further people's understanding and their like own path of healing. So, yeah, thank you.
We're so happy to have you. Your videos and the things that you talk about, the way you explain it, they're so impactful. And you're one of the most requested guests. Your videos are some of the top watched. I know I don't have my old channel anymore, but your videos were the most popular on my whole channel. It's beautiful, and it's just been really incredible for me to watch you bloom from the first interview that we did together to now you having your own channel, having your own audience, being able to hand that torch off. And it's really amazing to see how far you've come in such a short amount of time, and that just the big impact that you've made, the ground that you've broke with the way that you share your testimony, from the visuals to your unfiltered rawness, and just the beauty and compassion that you offer these conversations. As dark as they get, you also come out on the other side shining the brightest light. And I think that inspires people to keep going another day. And I know it's made a huge impact in my life. And so I know for you, you have been creating so many incredible videos. I love your dissociation series that you have on your channel. I love that you're posting more videos and that you're creating these series. And I'm really grateful that we can have these conversations here on this channel too. And I want to encourage people listening, please go follow and subscribe to Carrie's channel. She is just so good with being clinical with this information and providing it in a really grounded way that is palatable. The stuff can be really difficult to understand, and it can sometimes be really difficult even to listen to in certain contexts. And I think Carrie does a good job balancing all of that and treating it almost like a topic that you learn in school. At least that's how I feel. I feel like I'm going to class whenever I watch your videos where I can take notes and it's very comfortable. It's a very safe environment to learn that. But with that being said, we will be talking about programming today. We will be discussing abuse. We'll be discussing self-harm programming. And so with that being said, I just want to put a light trigger warning on this episode. If you are a survivor or somebody who might be going through a lot, feel free to come back to this video if something like that might not be something that feels good for you today. But I just wanted to kind of put that out there. This will be a really educational video. It's going to be very uplifting, but there will be a couple hard parts that we're going to talk about. So I just wanted to put that out there, and just have you guys, really take care of yourselves. So Carrie, with that being said, I wanted to turn it over to you and we can kind of start digging into all this information that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah. I think I'm gonna like preface what I was hoping to talk about today, which is going to be kind of following on my more recent videos that I've had on my channel, where I've started really focusing on like persecutor parts and then all of the different kind of categories of persecutor parts that you may deal with as a survivor. I'm just going to preface it with saying that, like, I think my original intention was to go more into, because we had gone a lot into like understanding like scripts and different interactions, hierarchy, different, roles in the system. And I had initially wanted to go more into like the geometric, structures and stuff like that. So basically, like, what if you were to look at, the overall layout of a survivor system of like all of the different parts, essentially. Um, I'm not going to go as much into that, mainly because it's something like, to me, like you were saying, like I really want to make sure if I'm going to be talking about something, it's like very like easy to conceptualize, basically, and like trying to kind of like simplify language or like make a lot have like a diagram or multiple diagrams that I can use to really help people understand. And I kind of took a step away from that a tiny bit, mainly because for two reasons. For one, because I'm in a position of like not necessarily wanting to share, the details of the exact layout of my own system. And because I use so many different examples from my own life to describe things, different experiences I've had and everything, it almost feels like, like showing people like what my internal structure is would be very helpful, but it also almost feels like the most like naked you could be. It's like it feels like, like putting like your whole internal everything on the outside. And so that's one reason. But the other reason is that in my experience, the kind of like the most impactful thing for a survivor, especially if you're dealing with, parts around like, denial or, like, we're going to get into, persecutor parts and stuff that use these different tactics to kind of like push you away from healing, push you away from knowledge that like you're trying to process, basically. That in my experience, having too much given to you from another survivor sometimes can like color your own interpretation of your system and your memories and everything. Like sometimes it can be totally validating, but also it's like it's very, especially system structure is going to be very unique to like the particular abusers you had and the particular traumas you went through. And it's like I don't necessarily want to be, giving people like a diagram that they're like, okay, I just need to like fill in the parts of like my own, because it may be a structure that's completely different than what you have, and it could actually send you down the wrong path, basically. So I don't know if that like totally makes sense, you know, but but I mean, yeah, the one thing that I would like to say about it is that, this is where in my channel I've been focusing on like understanding dissociation in general. Like you could be listening to my channel and be someone that has never dealt with ritual abuse or mind control and organized abuse or trafficking. You could be someone that has dealt with familial incest and like the abuse stopped there. That doesn't minimize it at all because it's still like when you're a kid, it's like it's just as devastating and it's your whole world. And for many people, it's gone on. You know, for a long period of time. And the familial stuff, has its own level of like attachment, kind of betrayal and triggers and everything. And my channel so far has been, to where I've talked about natural dissociation, which is, that's kind of what I would consider that versus manipulated dissociation intentionally by abusers. And that's like one thing I would say about it is like that would be the main difference in understanding a system structure as like as a survivor of like either of these camps is that if you have gone through incest and you haven't dealt with the organized side of things, like most likely you're going to have a very like organically created system too. Like it's like it might not have a specific structure to it. It might be like almost if you want to visualize like a tree or something like that, that you're going to have your initial core trauma, of like the first time you were abused, and then you're usually going to have, almost like a branching pattern of like where the consciousness is split over, as you've dealt with more traumas, different abusers or the same one and different traumas, throughout your lifetime. It may not have like a very like specific structure to it. But when you're dealing with organized dissociation, manipulated dissociation by organized parties, it's always going to have some sort of structure to it because the whole point of creating like intentionally manipulated dissociative system is that you're going to have in your life handlers, and those handlers are going to want to have the parts arranged in a way that to them is going to be predictable and almost like a filing system, but it's more like a visual three-dimensional filing system that would have compartments and groups and worlds and like different like barriers that you encounter, all this stuff that was like intentionally put there by the abusers because that is the whole point of mind control, is they're trying to control like the whole landscape of your mind and your internal world, and they really don't want to leave much room for like what the organic dissociation would be. They don't want to leave much room for you to have trauma parts that are existing outside of the structure they created for you. But when we're dealing with structures, really it can run the gamut. You could be dealing with something, three-dimensional. You could be dealing with something that's more plotted on a two-dimensional grid. Um, Regardless, you're always going to have parts that are like that job it is to internalize that shape and are going to have memories attached to being directed or shown that particular shape. And like I said, there's not much more I can go into without spending more time trying to like wrap my head around how to like describe it to people in a way that I feel like would be really like helpful and validating to them without kind of creating too much structure that they may get married to because they don't themselves have the full picture quite yet. So I don't know. Like, sorry, it was like maybe like a wonk wonk kind of intro. Be like, so hopefully it's like it didn't just people that want that information. Hopefully it didn't just like totally tease you, basically. But it's something I'm working on. Certain aspects of like what we deal with in this subject matter are more difficult than others to talk about, I guess, so in a way that makes sense. So I hope that makes sense.
It does. And even though this isn't exactly what you're talking about, where it's like an entire system structure, there have been guests on my podcast that have talked about different compartments that looked like a city or that
Mm-hmm.
looked like a planet, or looked like a forest, or looked like a room, a dungeon even,
Yeah.
So we've heard different visuals of what a person will find inside whenever they're digging into these parts and figuring out where they are. And that can be hard for people to conceptualize, and I can totally see how it would be really easy for some crossover to happen if people hear the information too prematurely, and also the vulnerability of sharing your own personal story with that, and in your own internal system structure, what that looks like, and of course all the respect for that. But there are just like small examples that people have heard on the show of some of the different structures that can exist within
Mm-hmm.
and where some of these parts live. So it's really fascinating actually, just thinking about, what our minds are capable of doing under those extreme duress and trauma situations that you and others have gone through. As it's so horrific to think about, and just to think about how protective our bodies are without us even having to do anything. And even the fact that many of you don't even remember your body's even doing this. Your body knows what it's doing in that moment, but the fact that we just have these reactions where we can respond under trauma in that way, to where our minds will just naturally protect itself and the body. It's actually really freaking incredible, what we're able to do with our mind internally, and what's possible in the case of needing to survive, like what we're able to do. We're not taught any of this growing up, and I think like we're sort of conditioned to think like how fragile we are, and we're on these like crap diets, and so many people like don't work out, and they feel worthless, and we're filled with medicine, and just all these different ways that society kind of beats us down. And you and others, I think it's a reminder of just like how resilient and incredible our bodies are, and like what we're capable of actually doing, hopefully not under the circumstances that you had to go through, but so many people just feel so hopeless every day. And it's like, man, if you just keep going, like there's so much on the other side of that. And I love hearing these different healing stories, and, just learning about our bodies, because as horrifying as it is, there's also such a big light to be shown on what we don't know about what we're capable of, both under stress, but also in healing, like what's possible, how much we can overcome through trauma, and like what trauma actually looks like, and the different ways that we can approach it, and, heal from the inside out, and like the difference that it makes in the world. So it's really neat hearing this from you, and it's really important that people get these understandings, so we can be a better support for people who have gone through such horrible things.
For sure. Well, thank you. Yeah, and yeah, that's it's reassuring, you know. I think that the main thing I would like to convey, especially if it's a survivor watching, is that like if you are like earlier in healing, as in you still have a lot of amnesia, maybe have an inkling that this might be what you're dealing with, but are still dealing with a lot of gatekeeper action and with a lot of parts being like walled off, then thinking about your system structure is not going to be helpful. It's not going to be an area you're going to be able to make much progress in, but also it's going to be, trying to get a big picture when it's like you're almost in the position of like trying to look at a map, like, well, you're, um, it's it's just something that is not going to be hugely productive, and it's almost going to might be like a distraction to just like working on processing and working with different parts and everything. If you're further along and have a lot of the amnesia filled in and you have really good parts communication, and if you're dealing with this particular ritualized abuse, organized abuse, then you are going to have like a large number of parts, So if you're kind of at the position where you are like have a lot of your story and a lot of your parts and you're just trying to figure out how they fit together, especially if you're trying to unravel like intentional programming that other people put in, like it's going to be very helpful. In which case, I always encourage the same thing, doing journaling, doing, drawing, for me early on, not early on in healing, but early on to like really starting to like understand, the degree to which I had been manipulated and programming had put in, and like the degree to which the parts had been intentionally created and everything. Just journaling in the same way, like always, just kind of just letting it flow, whatever images are coming to mind, whatever shapes are coming to mind. For me was super helpful because what it does is it does, once you're at that point, it starts showing you like the relationships between different parts. So especially if you're dealing with, like self-sabotage programming or self-harm programming, or, what often is kind of termed like booby traps in programming, to where it's, intentional, obstacles and stuff that have been put in by your abusers to prevent healing. In those instances, that's when understanding your system structure comes more into play, really, because it can start to help you understand like the relationships between different parts, and kind of the line of communication that's going on internally, to where you can actually, you can see it and start to be proactive about like processing the material that's going to like end those negative relationships internally. So I hope that makes sense. I guess what I did feel would be a little more helpful to people, regardless of where they're at in their healing, was kind of what my most recent videos have been about, which is really diving into like persecutor parts as like, as like a whole, I don't even know. It's like its own like category, I guess you would say, of alters that you're dealing with. A lot of my previous stuff had been about dealing with, your emotional parts, the child parts, trauma parts and everything, and really going into healing that. But other than, kind of getting a handle on like the flashbacks and the emotions and everything, like kind of like the next most important thing really is dealing with like your persecutor parts, or like your abuser allied parts. Because in my experience, those are going to be the parts that are holding you back from healing the most. They're the parts that, in natural dissociation, you're for sure going to have, like internalized negative self beliefs from, the abuse and the abusers and everything. But this is like really like in your system, like your abuser's like main weapon, I guess. It's like the main way that they can, control you, threaten you, ensure that like you're, staying within certain bounds of like thoughts, behavior, etc. It's really like the main internal like control mechanism that the abusers are intentionally, through trauma, implanting these parts, creating, splitting off these parts from your consciousness and giving them these very specific roles, because they're essentially like, the guards of the prison when you're not in, proximity to your abusers. That's like the whole point of mind control, and organized abuse is they want someone that they can abuse over and over again, a child they can abuse over and over again, that isn't going to be trying to escape, that is going to be like a willing slave, essentially, that they don't have to literally be like watching over at all times, because they know that they've implanted, they've essentially, split off all of these parts that are going to be playing the role of the abuser even when they're not around, and that's the whole, when you're dealing with organized crime, that's like their bread and butter. It means that you're going to be prevented from healing and not being useful to them in that way, but it also means you're going to be prevented from, really alerting any people, or, anyone that they don't want to know like what you're going through. It just ensures that, that you're you're not able to like ask for help, or to let them, to divulge any crimes or identities or anything that, you've been through. That's like, they're not going to continue to use someone if there's signs that that person is going to then start, telling what happened to them, essentially. Um, so really, like if you are in healing, then like all of your persecutor parts are going to be like fully engaged, basically. And you're going to be dealing with a lot because of that, because it's essentially, parts of yourself that, like any abuser allied part, spin Stockholm syndrome into being like, I need to play this role in order for this body, this to survive, essentially. So, healing feels, has been purposely created as like this very scary situation. This idea of like true freedom has really been created as like, really the scariest thing in the world to your persecutor parts. They're like convinced that if, this is something, if you're, it's like a bid for freedom and you're interested in just like running out the prison gates, they're pretty much there to be like, no, it's going to be way worse out there, and because they've often been, programmed with no-win scenarios where they've been shown when you're kids that that's not possible. That any attempt for escape is going to lead to worse scenarios, worse outcomes for you, more punishment, etc.
That's a really good explanation of that, talking about sort of the difference of how they invert freedom and slavery. It's the opposite of what somebody who didn't go through that would think. If somebody didn't grow up under the guise of being a slave, they would think that that type of lifestyle or doing that would just seem absurd. Like, why would you want to go lock yourself in a prison cell, when there's this whole world out here? But you see again the inversion of how they take the thing that's pure and the thing that, is God given to us, which is freedom and free will, and they make you basically think that that's non-existent for you and that that's not an option. And it's very fascinating how our bodies and minds can be so at odds with themselves because obviously not every single part has that ideology or that belief. They put all these different belief systems and all of these different wants and needs into all these different parts. And so, everything works really good whenever you're being handled and being programmed and you have somebody, pulling those strings and you're going along with it. Like you said, complying, not resisting, not trying to escape. And, all chaos kind of ensues whenever that's thrown off guard. Now, all of a sudden, the things that should be your human rights feel like a violation. It
Mm-hmm.
feels extremely scary to go outside the bounds of slavery, which is extremely sad to think, that any human being could be in those types of binds through abuse, and just the conflicts and being at odds with being free. It's really sad and just like the lack of support that we have so many times for survivors, and we just kind of like leave them at odds with that. We think like, oh, you should just be able to get over it, or you're fine, you're making such a big deal about stuff and you
Why
know
didn't you say something earlier?
Exactly, yeah. But it's like when you finally kind of get down to this nitty-gritty and you understand these macro and minor and micro details of how they structure this, like how you talked about last time, the hierarchy, and some of these different roles that these parts play. I mean, it's very intelligent how they do that. It's almost like having like an internal mafia in your body, where there's there's these sort of like this goal to like help facilitate the crime syndicate that you're born into or that you're into. And then you have certain parts of you that like want to get out, but there's such a stronghold of how you said, like being in a prison, basically having these different parts and these different roles that are like really trying to keep the order within the chaos, trying to keep it from being chaotic, even though the chaos is where the healing happens, because like you said, you can change the beliefs and you can have parts come in and talk to each other, integrate memory, and figure out a direction to go together instead of everybody sort of having like their own different role, their own different wants and beliefs. You can try to get everybody on the same page, but I mean, it's really incredible to think, that a small child is going through this, that they're just like, freedom is so foreign to them when it's a human right. You just look at like all the different ways that this type of abuse just breaches human rights. It's like it's very angering in a lot of ways, but it's also really amazing to see how you've overcome that. Like they did do everything that they could to keep you in that bind, and you're so far from that now. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's a process, you know. I think ultimately like that's one of the core things when it comes to healing is realizing that regardless of how all parts act and identify and operate, like they do actually, that is a huge part step in healing, especially with persecutors, is getting the parts to understand that pretty much everyone does have the same goal, is like as they're all going about it in very contrary ways, but ultimately like all parts, the child parts, that are dealing with a lot of emotion and like identify with the victimhood, or the persecutor parts that identify with the abusers and everything. The ultimate goal is survival. That's just literally, that's why we dissociate in general and have that as a defense mechanism. And just when we're looking at persecutor parts, they're the parts that have been convinced that they have to be like the abusers in order for survival to happen. It's like I know I've used it several times, the analogy of like a bully on the playground. Like they're only that way because like at home that's what they're experiencing, and that's like, so they are, perceiving because of, really bad examples in their life that like that this is how you interact with the world and how you get power and how you stay safe. You're constantly put in the position of being like seeing everything as like an equation. It's like I'm either the abuser or I'm the one getting abused. It's like when you understand that's the mindset of like the common bully in the schoolyard, it's like you don't feel like anger, like, oh, what a piece of shit that kid is, that he's always like pushing kids down or like calling them horrible things, or like it's like, yeah, it's like, well, he's doing that, she's doing that for a reason. And it's really heartbreaking to know that they've even been role modeled any of that stuff and been put in the position to feel like that's what they have to do to, to survive and not feel helpless and vulnerable in the world. And that's 100%, persecutors have just been convinced that, that a lot of times they've traded off, they've come to this understanding where they've never really experienced true love or emotion. So their defense mechanism is going to perceive that need as weak. Just be like, I don't need that stuff. Like I instead, they supplant their need for like, community and love and friendship and like, emotional satisfaction and everything and support. Since they have already been put in a position too many times where they know they're not going to get it, then instead they've, made this trade-off with like, well, it's like a consolation prize. It's like, it's power, it's, it's safety, it's less pain. It's, you start dealing with like, like we went to last time, like parts that are, motivated by access to like physical rewards. They're not getting like real, like emotional, belonging and love and everything. So instead they can be given drugs, or be given physical pleasure, whether that's, sexual or not, to just be like massage or something, but these things that essentially are like, well, I'm not going to get the things that they really want. So this is the thing that they're willing to settle for. And they are convinced that that's the only thing they're ever going to have access to. And so ultimately, like, that's what we need to see these parts as, is they're child parts that really did just want love and belonging, and to be part of a family and to not be hurt and everything. But that was like shown to them as like not an option, basically. And like I had mentioned, a lot of scenarios are created intentionally. Kids can be convinced of anything. And like, kids really get put in a lot of scenarios where the abusers convince them that, they put you in a situation and like don't tell anyone. And then they give you someone that seems like they're leading you on so that you do tell them. And then as soon as you do, you experience some sort of punishment or like some proof that the abusers knew all along, or have ears everywhere, or different things like that, when it's really just like your own reporting parts that have been, convinced to do this kind of role. So I mean, to me, like that's why, why we really have to have like so much compassion basically for the persecutor parts, and it's like it feels off-putting if you're a survivor to be like to have a part or multiple parts in your head that are just constantly tearing you down, like saying the worst things imaginable to you, and like being very self-defeating and just like, just the worst negative self-talk, whether that's like, calling you fat or ugly or stupid or over dramatic or over imaginative or just like, just totally gaslighting you basically, or even convincing you to do things that like, cause you to self harm or things like that. That it's like, it's all part of the same spectrum where they feel like, okay, this is what I have to do to like reinforce the system relationships, the structure, the barriers that we need to. And if we don't, then the other outcome is way worse, and most of us survivors are going to be at some point in healing, like free from like the physical, the consistent physical presence of our abusers, basically. So it really, comes down to showing those parts that, the only one that's perpetuate, like we're choosing to perpetuate the abuse on ourselves, when we don't necessarily have to. The caveat being, when we're getting into gatekeepers in just, a little bit that, sometimes because we're dealing with amnesia, sometimes we do actually have abusers in our lives and we are still being triggered, and they are because we have these amnesic blocks up. We may be healing certain levels but not aware of other levels of abuse, especially the more organized stuff, because that's usually the more buried, the more protected information, more protected parts of the system that, you can still be having that. It's, I don't know if I've mentioned it before, but, that was definitely the case for myself. I was dealing with healing the incest. I was dealing with healing the trafficking, but it wasn't until like I really started dealing um, with like the really organized abuse that I went through, like the governmental mind control and like the ritualized abuse that, I was able to recognize like, hey, I still had people in my life. It's like I've been in healing several years and then get to a point where I realize, hey, like there are people in my life that, and it's like I've always had this feeling about them, but I haven't known why. And then suddenly it's like you process those memories and it's like, oh, like this is someone from my past, or this is someone who's like intentionally triggering me. And I've been amnesic to not just their past role in my life, but I've been amnesic to the times I've been interacting in my more present life, and they've been triggering me, because that's how this kind of stuff works, is that that's one of the roles of persecutors, is to essentially, create these amnesic blocks in real time, to where someone can trigger you with like a hand signal or like a word, or like maybe you're hearing a specific like tone on the phone or different, different things. And like you in real time can like, have this amnesic block for that like little snippet of time and everything. And your other parts too, or maybe the same part whose role it is to like cover up that like short, gap in time, or maybe longer gap in time with like cover memories, or just, getting you to like not be like, hey, oh, I just like spaced out for like a few minutes or something like that. Like that was weird, whatever. And you just like move on with your day basically. So, yeah, it's wild, and it's a lot to wrap your head around, and I think the main thing for me that I really encourage people is just to, and will further you in your healing, is to do more trusting of your gut, and to also like really tackle what to me is one of the most difficult persecutor parts, like your denial parts, um, you know, head on basically, because that's a lot of times one of like the main tactics that your internal system, your internal persecutors and the gatekeepers are going to use to push you away from continuing the internal investigation and stuff, is to, to do what all of our abusers do in real life, which is to be like, no one's going to believe you, you're just crazy, you're over dramatic, etc., to where, you're in the habit of gaslighting yourself to where you have emotions, you have triggers, and are intentionally, a part of yourself is there to, to be like, don't look over there, for, and then for all of these different tactics they use to, just be like, you know, a lot of it. I'm using phrases because a lot of times that's going to be people's experience of, encountering these parts, is that it's going to be really repetitive self-beliefs, really repetitive, like phrases that have been intentionally given to you by the abusers, so that, it's like a script that these parts that play these roles have been given, to where it's like, they're like, okay, a boundary is crossed, we're starting to look into healing and stuff. And, the first step usually is going to be to like convince the victim, the survivor, oh, nothing to see here, you know?
Yes, 100%. And again, I love how you explain all of this, relating it to a bully on the schoolyard. Like I think it helps put in perspective how a person who didn't go through this can sort of relate to these parts in kind of a caricature that they are familiar with in real life, puts it in kind of perspective. And I love, again, the compassion that you add to this and shining a light on, kids aren't bullies because they just wake up one day and are like, I'm just going to go be mean to people. Like, that's programming in itself, one way or another. How you were saying with role modeling, whatever the reason is, it was a learned behavior, and not that, again, we should just give kids a free pass for that, but it's really a sign of trauma, whenever we see that. And so understanding that survivors of these organized abuses and these, ritualistic abuses have that within them that is constantly gaslighting and, denying and sort of holding back from achieving kind of healing and freedom. It really puts it in perspective. And so I wanted to ask for you, what strategies and ways did you find helped sort of integrate those parts into a place where they could accept freedom and start to let go of the gaslighting and kind of reckon with themselves and sort of want to work together as a team instead of being that persecutor?
Yeah, that's like, man, that's like a tough one. I think I would probably like continue like the bully visualization, or like anecdote or whatever, just because it feels like it might give people like so much of the healing is getting mutual understanding, basically. And that's so much of the difficulty when it comes to internal communication, is like you have this full cognitive dissonance where that persecutor part, the way they see their identity and their belief system and value system is like so antithetical to what, our normal day-to-day self that hasn't had to deal with these same level of traumas or have had it dissociated, that that is like the bulk of most of what I try and teach in my healing is coming to a place of mutual understanding. Like that is the thing that like bridges the gap between one part's understanding and another, into actually creating, rather than argument and fighting against each other, and this your day-to-day self that's trying to heal, just pushing, trying to heal so hard, and then having this other part here that's pushing the opposite direction, is like we have to stop pushing. We have to be the bigger person and stop pushing, if we're trying to heal like too much, or in the way we think we need to, and we need to actually like listen to what that other part's experience is. So going with the bully on the playground thing again, it's kind of like if you were I or another kid or someone were to like go up to that bully on the playground and be like, hey, I understand that like you're being bullied at home and like that's why you're being like this. What do you think the reaction is going to be? Most likely that bully is just going to like push you in the dirt and be like, "No, I'm not. I'm fine." Like there's nothing, like, you're like shut up. You know what I mean? They're going to be very defensive, because that is so ingrained in how they're reacting and why they're acting out, is that it's someone coming up to them, it's like telling an alcoholic that they have a problem or something, and they're going to be like, it's just going to be complete defensiveness, because if they're acting out in this way, they're totally invested, in this, Stockholm version of reality that's so different. And for you to then come in and be like, actually, you're the victim in the situation, is going to be literally what they've been trying to like the identity part of themselves that they've been trying to push away. That's why they're acting like an abuser, is because they're, they, it's too painful for them to consider, even for a moment, that maybe they're a victim. Like that's the whole point of the Stockholm and allying yourself with the abuser, is to not feel like the victim anymore. So for me, like I usually think like the best first step in dealing with like a persecutor part is to let them be themselves and just observe, basically, rather than being like, don't talk like that, don't say these things. Like, and the caveat being that I've many times, like when it comes to like early healing and dealing with the child parts that are coming up, you're usually not ready to deal with these persecutor parts right off the bat. You just need to deal with like these emotional child parts that are coming up. They're causing a lot of the flashbacks when you're first dealing with memories, in which case I have recommended, like creating barriers, basically a safe space to just interact with those parts that are willing to do the therapy, and then the parts that don't want to do it, just being like, okay, well then if you're not going to play nice, you can like sit outside. So that's where this changes. Basically, this is like the point that you've gotten to where you're actually trying to actively deal with these parts, and that does mean some discomfort. That does mean some sticking your, like choosing to, not just like, respectfully quarantine those parts so that you can get some sort of like peace and understanding. Like this is kind of like a more intense, but also in the long run more productive, very beneficial part of the healing process, is to like, okay, like people talk about shadow work and dealing with your shadow self. Like this is that part for a survivor, is being like, okay, I have these, these urges, these parts, these voices that I'm dealing with that are the bullies in the system. So now it's like choosing to like step into that, and not just be putting up, boundaries to keep yourself more manageable. So hopefully you've gotten to a place of like manageability to a degree, some stability before you start really trying to work with your persecutor parts. Um, so essentially, for me, like I always think the best thing is, it's always going to come back to journaling, is going to be just giving them the pen. And that means that you are going to be getting, you're going to be putting on paper some of like the worst shit that you never wanted to think you could think. It's going to be a lot of times putting onto paper, it's going to feel like almost like, um, to many parts, it's going to feel almost like you're making it okay to say these like horrible things to yourself, but it's not. Like we have to really, this is where the bully on the playground thing has to come in, is like you have to get to a place of mutual understanding, and you're not going to do that if you're trying to filter out what that part's experience and beliefs are. Like you have to take the observer role 100%, and that means, giving them the pen 100%, being like, no, I'm not going to filter it, I'm not going to judge it, I'm just going to let, you've already been hearing it in your head like nonstop, and it's been causing all of this difficulty. It's really just like any of the memories, it's going to feel like it's going to make it more real or more difficult to deal with if you externalize it and put it on paper, but it's always going to have the opposite effect. And you may also deal initially with, so these are the two different journaling exercises that remembers. One is that you're gonna just let them speak. All the beliefs they have about you, the rest of the system, all the beliefs they have about themselves and how powerful, whatever their identity is, their visual. You can do some visual journaling too, to kind of really allow them to express how they think they look, etc. You might, because we're dealing with persecutors, you might also deal with like a shutdown, to where they're going to be like, shut up, this is stupid, I'm not interested in engaging at all. But if you're dealing with this part and know that you need to communicate with them, you as the front person, the person that's doing the therapy and everything, are still going to be aware of the self-talk they've been giving. So in those instances, I'm like, you just have to journal it for them, basically. Like you have to just be like, okay, these are the repetitive statements of, lack of self-worth and just all of this stuff. You just have to like put it on paper. Like, these are the things, like, this is the voice that I'm dealing with that I need to work on. And that in and of itself can be an opening to dialogue for them, because at a certain point, if you're going to be writing what they're saying anyway, then they're going to want to engage, if nothing else, to tell you you're stupid for doing it. But this is like really like this is the beginning of work with persecutors, in my experience with every single one, is that I you just have to let them be themselves on paper, and then you have to be the adult in the room and start, asking questions, like, why do you feel that way? You just start trying to create like a dialogue, not something that's like, you shouldn't feel that way. Like, that's like, goes back to the old, like the old butting heads kind of thing and pushing against them. Like, you have to just be like questioning, internal, like non-judgmental internal investigation, and the more you can be non-judgmental, the more that's going to be role modeling to them that you actually are mature enough or like ready to like handle whatever they can throw at you. And it's going to take a lot of power away, because a lot of times, just like a kid acting out, they're doing it, because they're getting the reaction. If they stop getting the reaction of you being, scared, or, giving up in the way that they want you to, or that kind of stuff, and you're persisting and staying like calm, like, this is kind of where the reparenting part of healing comes in. Is like, you have to show, like, that you're willing to sit and understand. And the more you do, the more you're going to like foster this like mutual trust, where, really what you want is it to be switching what they see as like the most powerful influence in the world from their abusers to you, to the whole system, to your, to your adult self that's, choosing to process this stuff and heal. And that is, that's the way you do it. That's the way you role model it. Is you have to show them that you're, one of the main reasons they don't want to share what their actual beliefs or experiences are, or even when you get to finally dealing with the traumas that created them, a lot of it is focused around like forced perpetration and stuff like this, being put in the position of the abuser internally, but a lot of times being put in the position of the abuser where you had to actually harm, psychologically, emotionally, physically, or sexually another person. And that really solidifies that kind of thing. So those parts are going to be, usually your cult allied parts are more aware of the system as a whole than your day-to-day parts, because your day-to-day parts have been the ones living in this like fantasy, this dissociative amnesia that's been separated from the trauma in your life. So they're completely aware that them sharing this information is just going to like elicit, or what their fear is that them sharing the information of what they, participated in, or like the role they've been playing in the system, is just going to be met with like anger and disgust and shaming and judgment and everything, so that's a lot of why they do hold on to stuff. Is they're like, you know the only ones that are ever going to abuse me or understand me are the abusers. I'm not going to, share what I'm holding with like the front self, because I'm just going to be, treated with like, disgust, and I'm going to be like an outcast or something, even though that's already what they've been to a degree. But it's just going to feel like more real to them if they share it, and then they still get rejected, and that's like where that's really the only thing we can do in healing, is to show them that, it's like, no matter how horrible it feels like you had to be, or what you did, or whatever, that like we're really willing to just look at you as, a child that was trying to survive, and nothing, no shame, no judgment, none of that really. Sometimes it's easier said than done, but that's also like where, this is kind of like the next step in healing, is you do have to get to a point where you're able to, master the shame a lot of times, of those younger child parts, and really role model to the persecutor parts that like you've already been able to handle a decent amount of information, and been able to like, move forward, and all these ways that you've been able to like be more in control of your life, and it's become more manageable, because really that's all those parts really want too, is they just want to feel more in control of their lives and more, safe and everything. So if you show them that you've worked with other parts, you have like a good track record of that, of like going through the initial total lack of functioning when you were dealing with the flashback, but then afterwards how much more functional you were. It's like that's the kind of things like that's very like nuts and bolts evidence for them to be like, okay, like it's like a child soldier, you gotta lay down the weapon, and it's like they have to like really be shown that they're super, safe or whatever to be able to do that. Um, yeah.
Yeah, it's like you have to take what they're familiar with, which is how you were saying, like cult allied, more of like an abusive type of control, to where it's permitting you from having freedom and free will. And you almost have to like give them a model of how they can duplicate that in a way that still gives them that satisfaction of having control and having those things that make them feel safe, but with the added benefit of having freedom, of having your free will, in a coming down on the same level of everybody else instead of feeling like they're so superior, and being like, look, you can work as a team and we could actually get further this way, and we can do this ourselves. Like we don't need all this external puppeteering from people. We have everything that we need here and we can work together. And I think that's really important. I think some of those parts, a lot of survivors will kind of stuff back down because they don't want to deal with them, but that doesn't make them go away. That's not integrating, that's
It
not something.
reinforces the relationship actually.
Exactly, and one of the other things that you brought up that I wanted to touch on too is the self-harm programming. There's a lot of harm that happens outside the body that these parts are coerced and forced into doing, but they're also held responsible for, keeping everything intact internally too, and sort of deploying some of those same abuses onto the body if they step out of line in the same way that, maybe somebody or something would in the external world, and then they're forced to perpetrate, and I wanted you to maybe talk a little bit about that. I think most survivors aren't aware that this type of programming is inside of them until it's too late. And then all of a sudden they're trying to figure out, what is this? What am I going through? Why do I all of a sudden overcome with just these feelings of despair and, wanting to hurt myself and like being so out of control with being able to stop that from happening. And even people around survivors, it can be really easy to just, I'm going to send you to the psych ward, or, you need therapy. There's something wrong with you, and I'm not going to deal with you. I'm going to abandon you. We reinforce all this abuse, sometimes even unknowingly, if we're an ally to a survivor, without being empowered with having this information. And so I think, so many times survivors end up having more harm done to them than healing, when they should be so supported and have the tools and the information to get through these obstacles like you were talking about that are purposely put there. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about, the self-harm programming, self-elimination programming, and things that helped you as you were going through that, and maybe explaining to people who aren't familiar with that, what that is and why that is there.
Yeah, definitely. So, um, the self-harm programming is really going to be, for multiple reasons. Sometimes they're actually going to want you to kill yourself, basically, and you're going to be put through a lot of emotional overwhelm by parts in your system to, it's like, you know, Persecutor is like times 100. It's usually like all of the voices all at once to really overwhelm you, or maybe weaponizing past trauma memories that they know were just really devastating to you. Usually one's focusing around like abandonment and helplessness and hopelessness and everything, to really like push you in that direction. Sometimes it's going to be like that is their ultimate goal, is for you to like literally kill yourself, because you have been dealing with, you're just so overwhelmed and don't see a way out. And you end up in this very hopeless position, which for a lot of the experiences that we went through, it's very normal emotions, like they're normal emotions that are weaponized basically, because you were put in positions where it felt like death was inevitable, or like you would rather death over what it is that you were going through, basically. Um, but also, it can go back to what you were saying with the ending up in psych wards and everything. That can also be part of it. Like, it can literally be, something to make you destabilized, and self-harming to the point where the intention is actually not that they want you to kill yourself, but at least that you look that convincingly enough that it will get you into an institution, in which case they would have people, a lot of institutions are infiltrated, so it's essentially, putting you into a position where they can be like, okay, this person's programming is breaking down. They're starting to, recover memories that we are not interested in. Are they reprogrammable? Like, is it possible to re-access them and trigger them in a way that will force the system back into line, back into, not healing, amnesia, this kind of stuff. That's more likely if like you are someone that has really sensitive information, but especially if they have like continued use for you, essentially. So, that was one of the things that was like the most difficult for me to deal with, was just understanding that like, it's like anytime I was dealing with really like processing like really big information, or really big parts that were supposed to be inaccessible to like my day-to-day self, that it would not only be the self-harm stuff that I would be dealing with, but it was also like this idea that I needed to like run away, basically, that I needed to just run away either voluntarily to a psych ward or just to an isolated situation, basically, and it felt like the only, the total, self-destruct of my life, and relationships and everything, but just essentially realizing that this was like a program, like script, like a sequence of events that would happen every single time. So it doesn't necessarily get like, you kind of have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable and healing, because, um, it, I don't know, I don't want to sound discouraging, but it's like, it never really, the emotions are always the emotions when they come up and you're dealing with flashbacks. Like, that really never gets easier. It's always going to be as in, like, you really, to heal, you really do have to feel it, have to integrate those parts, whole experience. And that means dealing, with some really heavy information, some really heavy emotions and everything like that. But if you need to get to the point where you can, this is like another observer thing, be like, okay, like to start recognizing your own patterns, in your own thought process, to be like, okay, every time I start dealing with, some new information, I'm going to be dealing with these feelings of self-harm. I'm going to be dealing with these feelings of like needing to like abandon my life and run away. And what is the most important is to realize that like we are creating the circumstances for them accessing ourselves in those positions. It's not like someone's literally coming in and throwing us in the back of a van and taking us off to a psych ward. A lot of times it's parts that have been convinced that this is what they need to do. This is the role. This is part of the persecutor stuff. This is their role in the system, is like, if lines are crossed, then this is the thing that they need to do to feel safe again, basically, and feel less crazy again, or feel more in control again. It's something that, that really, it's, you could look at like an abused dog that still goes to like its master's hand, or an abusive relationship too, I guess, too, like people that are in relationships with abusers, is like that they, are so longing for that love bombing part, that attachment need, that they're willing to like go back to something that is not the best, because it's just what they've come to know as like the closest thing that they can feel to safety. You know what I mean? Um, so I mean, like, I guess this point would be, because we kind of been talking like around it, is like gatekeeper, is like maybe go to like the diagram, just because I think it's like a visual that usually I give to people to, or I did in like the last video, to kind of conceptualize, when we're talking about crossing boundaries, when we're talking about dealing with, you know, parts that hold information or groups apart that hold, specific areas of information and traumas in your life, like what you're dealing with essentially. And for most people that have dealt with organized abuse, they're always, I think it's the next or the previous one. Yeah, there you go. So when you're dealing with gatekeepers, basically it's always going to be what, um, if you're dealing with organized abuse, in my experience, my understanding, you're going to have gatekeepers 100% of the time, because that's like the whole point of like the managed dissociation and the intentional structure is that they're, the individual trauma pockets are going to have, be walled off from the consciousness, but it's almost like them creating like layers or levels of barriers additional, so you almost have like, a guard that has like a whole cell block basically under their control, like each individual part is split off, that's how they, they're just each dissociated trauma parts, but you'll have a part that's essentially knows all of the parts that they're guarding and all of the information or trauma or, abuser's identity, organized crime, whatever it is, they're going to know kind of like have like a bigger picture understanding of all of the parts that have dealt with this same stuff and are basically when you start trying to deal with one part in that area, basically one part in that cell block, it's gonna trigger the gatekeeper, regardless of who it is in that area that is like trying to heal, that you're dealing with flashbacks and stuff. You're going to be dealing with like usually the same gatekeeper for this kind of information. So that's like the top graph is like normal dissociation. This is kind of how often I've shown just like visualizing how um, dissociation just normally works. It's like the central line is going to be starting at like your first trauma event, and the first like splitting of your consciousness, essentially. And then you're going to have essentially lines, branches off of there where future splits have happened. And then sometimes within, a part that's split off, if a similar trauma happens, but it's further amplified, then you'll have parts split off from that previous part into where you have almost like a branching situation. Or sometimes you'll have groups of parts because that's how people's brain is decided to really dissociate the information, is to break a single trauma event into all its individual parts, the physical sensations, the auditory, the emotional sensations, the like knowledge, the overall knowledge of like what this trauma meant for you and your identity and your life. A couple of different ways that it can go, but essentially like the white dots, are like all of your trauma pocket nodes, and then like the black dots would be essentially the gatekeeper that's located at the, kind of at the first split point to kind of block off all of those other points. So each of those are like their little cell blocks that they're guarding. And when it comes to natural dissociation, we could see that this is something like gatekeepers are something that would naturally happen, because especially if like you have tried to like disclose your abuse, many people, it's unfortunate, but like many people are like, oh, why didn't you like say something earlier? Like a lot of times, like when kids are in these situations, when they do say something earlier, what they're met with is disbelief, or like they're in an abusive family structure where it's the most common thing that it's easier to just say that the victim coming forward with abuse is crazy, and to like not deal with the abuser, not deal with what that implies for the family, and like, okay, now we have to, change up, divorce dad, or we have to deal with this sibling that's abusive, or we have to, suddenly it's an uncle and we have to suddenly stop, going to Christmas with everyone, so that a lot of times is the kid a lot of times has been role modeled that like, if they do disclose, nothing's going to be done about it. They're going to be seen as crazy. And that's essentially going to make, their experience of the trauma in their life, like compounded infinitely, basically. So in natural dissociation, you will have gatekeeper parts for sure that are there to basically block off all of the incest, all, it, to essentially, be just another barrier to be like, okay, I can just pretend this never happened. And then I can just, continue to go to Christmas with my or sit at the dinner table with my abuser and something, and I don't have to deal with it. I can just pretend like nothing's happening. So that's like the natural way that a gatekeeper could happen. When you're dealing with manipulated dissociation, then you're going to have like very, because they've created a system structure for all of these parts to essentially inhabit and live in these different worlds, these different cell blocks, whatever you want to like, whatever is a pertinent visualization for your experience, then it's going to be more like you're going to have parts that deal with certain types of knowledge, certain types of abuse, but a lot of times it's going to follow less of a timeline, essentially. It's like you may have been trafficked at like 3 and 5 and 7 and 9 throughout your life, and it's like all of those memories of trafficking are all going to live in like the same area that's guarded by a gatekeeper, and then you'll have another area that's dealing with another aspect of your life, like the incest that you were dealing at home, essentially, and that's going to be kind of filed into a different area with a different gatekeeper. So that's kind of like the levels that we have here, trying to describe for people that are just listening. Is that we have essentially like at the top dot would be your day-to-day consciousness, and the part of yourself that's choosing to heal, but is also completely amnesic to all of the levels below it. So we have this like, almost like this wall or this line that exists to separate, your day-to-day self, your day-to-day existence from all trauma knowledge at all. With organized dissociation too, in my experience, it's gonna follow this progression as well, because in healing you're going to be going kind of like deeper and deeper through these different levels, essentially. And a lot of it is because we have to look at this almost as like, an intelligence agency or something, where they're going to have different levels of classified information. So if you're dealing with like an organized network, usually they're going to be fine with, not in all cases, but many people were in the same case as me, where their parents weren't necessarily high up in the hierarchy of the organized crime that they were involved in. They were there because they had sold their kid into it. But for the organized crime hierarchy, the abusers, they're kind of like the first people they're going to want to throw under the bus. They're going to be like the ones that they're like the most willing to like give up. So a lot of times, they'll have like incest as like, even though like if we were to look at the timeline, incest was probably like the first real trauma that like the programmed person went through that kind of created the initial splits. It's still going to be seen as like the least the least sensitive information. So if the survivor starts to remember their abuse, they're going to hope that they, meaning the abusers, are going to hope that you're going to be like, okay, it was the incest with my father, that all of my PTSD symptoms, all of the depression, all the reasons that I'm here and healing it all is just because of the incest with my father, basically. And that hoping that, you'll, just dealing with that will take up all of your time, basically, all of your energy, all of, and that you'll be like, okay, I've healed enough. This is enough, and that you'll never want to like look beyond it, basically. So on this, I don't know, this graph, basically, that's the first black node would be the gatekeeper that's meant to keep the incest away from your day-to-day consciousness. The first one you're going to be really dealing with to be like, okay, this is stuff that I went through and I need to come to terms with it and process it if I'm going to get anywhere in like healing and manageability in my life. So each of these barriers, to circle back around to the self-harm programming, each of these barriers, when you cross it, that's usually when you're dealing with organized abuse and manipulated dissociation. This is usually when you're going to encounter all of the feelings that we were talking about: the self-harm, the feeling like you're crazy, needing to go to an institution, to like a mental hospital or something. Or if they've intended it for you, like actually killing yourself and just nipping the problem in the bud for the abusers before you're able to uncover anything that's more sensitive. This was definitely my experience, like that I didn't know that I was dealing with this programming at the time. But when I very first started healing, that was what, I was working on was, okay, understanding the sexual abuse and the incest with my father. And, what came about, was that it's like you're dealing with the emotional overwhelm of and grief and all those things you have to deal with when you're wrapping your head around the incest. But then it's like I was also dealing with like this intentional programming that was there to to kill myself or to check myself in basically to a mental hospital basically, because it was either that or I was going to kill myself. And that was just like we talked about before, the persecutor parts is like it's going to be really repetitive, like self-defeating self-talk. For me it was very much like I had always wanted to like help the world, and I was just like in this position of like if I can't even, I was dealing with being not functional anymore in like my job and my relationships and just constantly dealing with flashbacks and emotional overwhelm from the memories I was dealing with. I was like, if I can't even keep it together to help myself, like how am I going to help anyone else? So that was like the repetitive thing was like I might as well kill myself, I might as well kill myself, I might, it's like it was this weaponized thing. For me, like looking back on it, though, it was more about me getting to the point where I would be checking myself in to, to a mental hospital, because I did continue to get used and triggered by the abusers after that point. After my healing, there were still a couple of instances where I was trafficked, and used essentially. And so I was still an asset to them, So there was an attempt to keep me at a place of functionality and to alert the abusers to the fact that my programming was breaking down, basically, so that you could have this like kind of containment system, come in basically. Um, but also, when we're looking at these levels, um, this is really the progression that we just naturally need to go through too in our healing, because realistically, like even though I had all of the triggers and PTSD stuff and flashes of memories of the trafficking stuff or the ritual abuse that I went through, it just was more stuff that convinced myself I was crazy because I didn't have any context for any of it or like where it came from. So really, like this is the progression we need to take in healing anyway when we're dealing with these gatekeepers and these levels, because you're not going to be able to deal with like the worst trauma unless you've dealt with like the more, you know, unfortunately, the more common traumas, first. Like for many people, they know about incest, but not everyone has the full context for like trafficking or ritual abuse. So I'm gonna stop there for some water and like just make sure that this is like making sense, I guess.
It is. I love how you divided it into layers like this because I think that's one of the most confusing parts is a lot of people do stop at one of these and they don't reach the deeper levels, and it can be so confusing trying to get the big picture when you don't know all the layers. And, at its core, that really is like where the mind control, the governmental abuse, the forced perpetration, like how you have down there, it's like the real nitty-gritty stuff that implicates the most amount of people at these higher levels in these different institutions and sort of like connects the whole web. That's the part that they don't want you to get to, and a lot of
Hmm.
people reach the trafficking or the satanic ritual abuse, and it's so confusing. They're like, what is all this, without knowing the layers underneath it, but you see how you're explaining they have all these fail safes in place, almost like a computer, like
Hmm.
it's staggering how similar our brains can be to a computer and how pliable we are to being programmed robotically, just like a computer is, and how there can be different layers to it. We have like our front home screen where there's like, files that are available for anybody that walks by to see and that are really user friendly for somebody to jump on the computer and operate and know what they're looking at. that sort of make sense and that you can see. But then there's like so many different layers almost to the point where, somebody can manipulate a computer to where there can be things hidden that maybe only a hacker could get into, or a coder. And so you think about all these different layers that they put into a human mind, a psyche, a soul, and how difficult it can be to get to those layers, and how you were saying that there's sort of those blockages where it's like you have the gatekeeper standing at the gate, with his sword, and he's like, you cannot pass, and if you do, there's like a burning bridge right behind him that you have to try to figure out how to go over. And if you survive, you get to see what's on the other side, but it is really fascinating how sophisticated this is and how deliberate it is, and that these things and these layers, they're not random. They're all put there by design. They're all hoping that you don't get to the bottom layers, and there's so many different obstacles in the way to keep you from getting there.
Yeah. Totally. I mean, the computer analogy is wonderful, and it really, it's like that's what we're talking about is we talk about programming, and that's a lot of why is because it is very reminiscent of how a computer is designed. And this is really what how they treat the human brain is they're just creating neural pathways, and they're just creating like dissociative trauma, like so it's basically like using trauma as like the tool for crafting these neural pathways, in a child's developing brain, basically, and so it's how they've hacked their way into the system, essentially is like by understanding, the subconscious and dissociation and how trauma interacts with all of this stuff, so, and especially attachment needs, like it's crazy, but it's also why it's been able to become so formulaic to the point, where it's not necessarily easy, but it's like straightforward for them to like for anyone in the know to create these kind of like mind controlled slaves out of traumatized children. But it's also why we can have conversations like this and heal is because it's systematized to a point that it's something that you can unravel the opposite direction too, is to see how these things were created. And then to, once you can see what's going on, it's a lot easier to to, for it not to have power anymore, at least not the same power, and give you like kind of like an opportunity for working with your own neural pathways in the same way that they've, hacked into them basically. Um, it's very it's very similar, you're kind of becoming your own programmer, but in a positive sense, you're having to like work out these riddles and then figure out what the next step is, and so just like briefly, it's like we have like the incest area, the level below it that has like another gatekeeper, and another like barrier or wall would be like trafficking essentially. So that would be, now you're not just being abused by your parent, but now you're being sold essentially into child pornography or into like child prostitution kind of things. Now you're dealing with like many abusers basically, and that's comes with a whole other layer of implication of like abandonment and stuff like that, and it's going to have a whole other layer of emotions. But what essentially is like I want to show too is like talking about the suicide and self-harm stuff is that it's something that is often going to be triggered every single time you cross like into a new area. It's like it's going to be kind of like the same stuff that you're going to go through trying to scare you off basically from starting to deal with it. So there is a lot of times when you're dealing with big processing, it's always going to feel like it's getting worse before it gets better because you're like activating defense systems, and it's like you just like the more you do it and the more you're able to observe, it's like be mindful that like suddenly you're experiencing really intense emotional upheaval that isn't connected to the flashbacks you're dealing with or isn't connected to your current life circumstances. You can be kind of somewhat alerted to the fact that you're dealing with, intentional programming that's there to create self-harm and sabotage and everything like that. Um, it's like it's one of my main tells. Like once you get to a point of dealing with it all the time, it's like one of the main tells when I know that a flashback I'm dealing with like has bigger implications or is like, going to give me access to a lot more of like the amnesia and everything is like when I do start experiencing all of these self-harm and runaway programming, it's almost become predictable to where it's like if I start feeling that, it doesn't make it any less comfortable to experience, but it does still it takes a lot of the power away of like feeling the urge to act impulsively on these things because you have some context for why you're feeling them and understanding that that acting on them is actually going to push you the opposite direction slash it's temporary. This is like, it's going to feel like this is something that you're never going to get out of, like a depression or like a feeling of suicidality or whatever that, or if you're checking yourself into a thing, like I'm always going to be broken. I'm never going to be functional, all this stuff. It's going to make it feel like a very black and white absolute situation that's never ending, which it was for your child parts. You had no end in sight for years of any hope of being in a position where you could be free. So there has to be a certain level of like, of kind of just holding tight and like sitting through it and like journaling the crap out of this kind of stuff as opposed to acting on any of it. That's always going to be the main thing because in my experience, it's always going to get better. The more you can face it, the more you can put context to it. And it's like I said, it's not comfortable, but all you have to do is survive, do whatever you need to do to survive your way through it without doing anything self-destructive, and things will get better. It's like, and on the other side of it, in my experience, you're going to have way more understanding of yourself and wholeness and like so many more gifts, like that you would have never even been able to like fathom, basically levels of freedom and being able to be present, happy, like all of this stuff. It's like always comes on the other side of actually, working through these barriers, basically. Um, so yeah, it's like incest, trafficking, and then you have another gatekeeper wall, and then you would have like ritual abuse. And obviously not everyone has gone through all of this stuff. For some people, it'll stop at incest when it comes to their actual experience. For some people, it'll stop at trafficking. Other people will deal with like ritual abuse, which is, being used in actual rituals, or ritual abuse as in, you were going through repetitive and like intentional, like torture and stuff like that. Like trafficking can exist outside of that framework. It can, just be someone trying to like make a buck off of you or like gain influence off of you, essentially. But when you're dealing with ritual abuse, that's really when you're like fully in the manipulated dissociation like area. That's like when, you've had intentional abuse perpetrated on you to intentionally create split parts, basically. And this is also what's going to be more off limits to you and the system because it's going to be even more intense trauma than you've dealt with before, a lot of times involving intentional torture and stuff like that. But also from like the intelligence standpoint where it's like classified information, at that point you're going to be dealing with more, people that have more interest in concealing their identity, basically, and more means to do so with like drugs, hypnosis, and very elaborate events, either occult rituals or like, military, abuse, which would be, more, or I don't know, it would just be more systematized, like intentional torture, basically. And then you have below that essentially where we would put all of our hierarchy parts, essentially, and the parts that you may see as like demonic or psychopathic or like 100% abuser allied, and these are usually going to be the parts that are enforcing the all of the punishment that you've been dealing with up until that point, basically. So all of the, they're going to be the ones that are orchestrating the pulling of the levers of being like, okay, when this person, starts, when the front person starts breaching these areas, these are all of the different parts and programs we're going to weaponize against them. These parts are 100% Stockholm, 100% cult allied, a lot of the times because their traumas involve forced perpetration and everything like that. So they're very invested in their role within the cult, and they're willing to play, they're willing to play whatever role was given to them to a T. It feels like their identity, their duty, and it feels like survival, basically. And that's kind of where we end up at the bottom, is like the very lowest, is going to be like the hierarchy we talked about last time. It's going to, that's going to be the end of your therapy in my experience. It's not the end of your healing. You're always going to have to deal with a lot of shit, but it's going to be, the the parts that the abusers least wanted to be revealed or to heal and stuff. And a lot of times too, it can be because these parts hold a lot more overall knowledge of the system that they don't want, because that's your keys to getting out, but also because these are the parts that are trauma bonded to your abusers. Therefore, they know your abusers and their identities like way more than anyone else, any other of your parts. And that for your abusers is like their last thing they want to ever be uncovered, is their identity, their role, their crimes that they perpetrated.
Now, in those moments where you're crossing those barriers, where it's sort of, firewall that you're trying to get through to uncover more memories, and you have these self-harm programs, self-elimination programs going off. I know everybody's different, but I'd love to hear how you navigated that just in that moment, and what tools we can give other people today to put in their toolbox if they find themselves in that moment of wanting to act on those feelings as they come up, and being able to navigate through that so they don't actually go through with it.
Yeah, I think that the main thing that is going to be accessible to everyone is always going to be journaling. So just kind of like when I was talking about persecutor parts, being able to like vocalize all of the horrible crap you would never want to externalize, that goes for like the self-harm parts too. So literally just like sitting down with paper and just writing out all of the feelings that you're feeling, essentially. And it's because, like I mentioned this often, it's been one of the main things that's created like a path to healing in my experience, because it's something that I learned from Kathy O'Brien, and her method of healing, and really focusing on what Mark Phillips talked about with the journaling, because it's a brain science thing. It's going to feel like the last thing we want to do in the world in that situation, but we just have to really like force ourselves to do it and to externalize it, because shifting your that information, that traumatic information, from like the emotional part of your brain to the logic and communication side of your brain is in and of itself going to lessen the intensity of those feelings, lessen the urgency of those feelings. Is going to take that past emotion and it is going to bring it into the present in the way that your other parts can then actually have a little bit of access to it, and momentum in like getting some perspective on it, basically. So that's always going to be the first step, is like, like if you are feeling like, you're crazy and worthless and belonging in an insane asylum, that's what you write. If you're feeling, like these are all the reasons I should kill myself, that's what you write. Like you have to, externalize all of that, basically. And it's going to feel initially scary and depressing and everything, but I guarantee you it's going to be the first step into getting out of those feelings. You have to do that first. um, Another thing that's been really helpful for me is been to and in those instances we're not even focusing on like we're just focusing on stability, and kind of coming from like 100 down to 90 to a place where you can just like be able to get through your next day or your next hour or whatever. Processing needs to come at a time when you are already, feeling in a place to handle it. So don't think that, like that can be a big part of the black and white feelings. Like when you're dealing with these parts is going to be like, well, I can't handle this. I'm never going to be able to handle it. And it's like in that moment, don't handle it. You don't need to like, if you're pushing into an area that's bringing up all of these feelings, then that's the point when you put on the brakes and focus on stability instead, and that can be whatever it is you need. It can be even like crutches in your life if you're talking about, like dealing with things that you normally would be like, okay, like, comfort eating, or or like, like buying yourself something nice, or just like it's just, or even, smoking a little weed or something, like things that might in other times be seen as like, hey, I shouldn't be using a crutch. Like if you're literally at the point where you're going to kill yourself, use that fucking crutch, as long as it's not like actively hurting yourself or someone else, like, and caveat is going to be like, I feel differently about, different medicinal plants than I do like about alcohol, for example. Like if you're dealing with suicide program, please do not reach for the bottle, because, really the first step in your healing, if you're still in active addiction of hard substances or alcohol, should be, sobriety should be the first step, basically, because, that is just something that's going to decrease your it's going to increase your impulsivity, essentially. It's going to facilitate like fully switching into these parts and stuff like that. So do anything you need to do that's a crutch, that's like grounding and not increasing self-harm, basically. So it's like, that's kind of where I give like the caveat. It's like you don't want to do something that's like actually going to lead to, your the likelihood of your self-destruction, basically. But if it's something that like feels like a guilty pleasure or something, like fine, what I mean? Like it's not that big of a deal, and even I look back on like, if you really feel like you're going to kill yourself and you need to go to the hospital, then do that, then do, like, I mean, yeah, we can be like, oh, well, maybe things are going to be, putting me on radar of some shit, you know what I mean? But it's like, it's still better than a permanent solution. You know what I mean? It's still, if that is like what you need is like medication and a safe place and people watching you 24/7, you know what I mean? Like some, like that might be what you need, in that moment, just to get through, and this is like where we're really talking about, if you're, actively going to kill yourself. Like that was where, where I was at, very much was like, I had a plan. I was giving away things. I was like, it was all of the stuff, that like, and it was like the point when I hit the point of no return, it's like, I checked myself into a hospital instead. Like I said, that was by their design, but it, the alternative would have been me killing myself, and then I would have never had the opportunity to move forward in healing. So that's kind of where we need to journal. We need to do whatever we need to do to essentially, live past this like hump. And that's part of it too, is we have to constantly reassure ourselves that this is temporary, that it may feel like it's forever, but nothing is forever, so this feeling of needing to self-destruct, it's like, even if it doesn't feel possible that it can have an endpoint, you just have to take my word for it. You just have to take the word of other survivors for it to be like, hey, what you're feeling is horrible but normal, and if you can, persist, you will get to a point where you don't feel this intense, and at that point you can process. At that point you can figure out what to do next, but you just have to get through that, and just kind of white knuckle it to a degree. The journaling helps. Like I said, like me checking myself in was better than the alternative, so if that's like where you're at, then do it, basically. It really has to be whatever you need to get through that. And then the last thing would be if you have a safe person to talk to, whether that's a therapist, or in my case, a lot of times it was my partner, it's, or a friend, someone that like you're able to share what you're going through, and hopefully already, has a little bit of context of like why you would be, dealing with these feelings, basically. In my experience, just like journaling externalizes it and decreases the intensity. Sharing with someone that you feel like you can trust, and can hold space for you is healing beyond words, really, because it does a couple of different things. For one, it shows you that you're not alone and that you are loved, and that there, all these things that are being repeated in your head are not true. You have evidence of that. But also for me, it's always been, especially later on in healing where I'm dealing with this, you know, stuff repeatedly, being triggered repeatedly, is like I can verbalize it and share essentially that I'm having these urges that feel, are scary and I feel like I can't get out of, and you can have an external source to just be there to remind you, like, hey, things have got, you've felt this before, things have gotten better before, like, don't act, that it's like if someone can just help you recognize that this is programming you're dealing with, that goes a huge way to just, to taking a lot of the power and the urgency away from it and the trust that it's temporary, basically.
Thank you for all of that. That was so good and so helpful. And I think it helps to be able to separate the emotion from the emotion inside from what you're wanting to do on the outside.
Yeah.
The reaction and being able to separate that and kind of like look at it from differently instead of like identifying with it and saying, I need to react on this feeling now because I have this feeling versus I'm feeling this way. What can I do with that feeling that's not going to be reactive? How can I take a step back and kind of like look at that? And it could be hard in moments, even for people who didn't go through what you did, to just be filled with, dread or grief or despair. No matter who you are, it's like a very overwhelming emotion. And like we want to get out of it so bad. It's really easy to want to just do whatever we can in that moment. Like you said, even grab a bottle of alcohol just to like, wash the pain away and like escape for a minute. But I think going back to what you said, true healing really happens whenever you can separate yourself from it and like look at it holistically before reacting to it, and sometimes you do have to make a choice. Like you said, it can be so extreme that you need to make a choice. You can harm yourself or you can go check yourself into, a psychiatric ward or get help. There are some times where you do have to make a decision that maybe both options aren't good, but you have to pick the safest and best option that's going to keep you around, in that moment. But I really love how, you expressed writing and some of these other really helpful tools that can hopefully encourage people to keep those things nearby, in the safety of their home or put it in their backpack, and or purse, and just have these things, have people, have a little phone list of people that you can call if you're in those moments of despair, and to just sort of have like a little plan for yourself in case this comes up. That way you have options to do before reacting to what your body wants you to do or to what the programming is directing you to do. And before we move on from this, I had put out some feelers for questions, and I appreciate the people that submitted them. We're going to try to answer some of them this episode. Whatever we don't answer, we'll do another episode. Obviously, Carrie is a regular on here, so we'll get to them at some point. But you had talked about Stockholm syndrome, and somebody had asked about unlearning Stockholm syndrome for those parts. And I wanted to just run that by you. Any advice that you have for people who have parts that are still very loyal, and how you can sort of, you know, get them to align with each other and with you versus the external hands that have always been controlling them.
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to mention on the last question or topic too, with the
Mhm.
self-harm is like, just one other thing that worked for me. So sometimes you can just deal with like punishment programming that's like cutting or something like that. And a workaround for me, when you're, especially because I was dealing with like programming that I used a lot early on, was when I had the overwhelming urge to cut, basically that I would use like a red marker to like instead to basically and it sounds stupid, like I understand that this sounds like crazy and stupid and like why would this work, but it totally did, and because I did have a history of dealing with cutting as like punishment for like disobeying and all of this different crap, and when I dealt with it later in healing and knew that it wasn't a behavior I wanted to participate in anymore, it's kind of like how the watercolor journaling has been for me, is to allow parts to express themselves and to do it, and that was a workaround for me, is like, initially, and I didn't even have to do it for very long, because I just started meeting that part on their terms and understanding it, and then, externalizing it, having the conversation took a lot of like the power away from them wanting to play those roles. Essentially, was to validate them in a degree, understand the level of intensity and the fact that they felt like they need to punish us, or that, that they needed to like externalize the pain that they were feeling, and so we did it. We, kind of met them halfway, did it in a way that didn't, actually physically harmed us, but still validated that, wounded child part, in this case, teenage part, that like felt like this was what they needed to do in these instances. I've also, if it's, pain that might be more satisfying to those self-harm parts, I've also heard recommended for people that cut like, snapping a rubber band on your wrist or something, like, or wherever on your body, basically, because similar process, that's not what I did. That's not what I needed. For me, it was like, it felt like it needed to be a more visual thing. But for other people, it's like the pain that triggers like, okay, I'm doing what I'm supposed to. And now, because that's what the parts that we're dealing with, they feel their own, urgency, this need. They've been put in positions that have programmed them to doing this, where essentially, that is the only thing that created relief, was them playing that role, So we have to, to have them stop, trying to enact this and force us to do it in general. We have to, try and do what we can, as front parts to, validate what they're feeling, and that'll decrease the amount that they're, pushing for that, another example is to have like the run programming and stuff like that, and a lot of times it's run back to abusers and stuff, but a lot of times it's like I could satisfy it by planning a spontaneous trip with my partner or something like that. So something that like did physically, on a certain level, physically satisfied that feeling, but it was something that we chose consciously to do, that was going to, satisfy that urge without it being in a way that was going to, facilitate the abuser's access to us, or, that kind of thing. Um, so yeah. But when it comes to the Stockholm syndrome question, a lot of that's been kind of what I've been talking about with like the persecutor parts, and I think maybe if we just talk about like what is seen as just like the typical examples of Stockholm syndrome, is like, you look at kidnapping victims, for example, especially if they were like, young, or, but you have people that are older too, and they essentially, they get kidnapped by someone, and they're put in a position where they have no hope of escape. Maybe they've tried escaping several times and been shown it's not possible, then their reaction a lot of times is going to be like, okay, I'm going to minimize the emotional distress by thinking that I want to be here. I want to be in this cage. I want to have this sexual relationship with this horrible abuser or perv or something like that, it makes you feel in control of the situation. And that's like a way of mentally dealing with something you can't escape from. So a lot of the Stockholm syndrome help, to me, it also comes from like mirror work, or different ways that like we can, like, evidence that we can show those parts, that we are not still physically under the control of the abusers, and also show that they're not in the same proximity to us, and show them that essentially that we have physically a much older body, and, a much more adult life and abilities and resources and stuff than we did at the time that they were created, because that's the mindset they're stuck in. So going back to like, journaling, you can let them journal everything that they feel about, relationships, positive relationships they may feel like they have towards the abusers, different stuff like that. And that's when, once we have those lines of communication open, we have to like gently start like asking them to look at things in our life, to see, if there's ways that we can show them that, that the world that they were in is not their current world anymore, and show them, start introducing them little by little to parts that hold all of the identity with the trauma and everything, and be like, you're, the people that you thought loved you, put you through all, put you through all this. And no one likes being a fool. So a lot of times it's also being shown that, like, the degree, the parts that have the understanding, the degree to which your abusers can traumatize and manipulate you, the ones that work through it already usually are the ones that help facilitate for, you know, more Stockholm syndrome parts, to show that, that they in fact were lied to and manipulated. And there's all these reasons that, that the freedom they want doesn't come from being allied to the abuser's wants and needs and anymore. And then the mirror work that I mentioned, it really goes into, that's once you dealt with like some communication, because this is like more jarring if like you haven't done a lot of trying to create this like bridge of communication and understanding, is then to start, doing literally exercises where you can, you know, there a lot of times the Stockholm syndrome parts, the persecutor parts, are the ones least identified with your actual body. They're least identified with your actual day-to-day identity, and they have, a lot of times they're able to enact these kind of, bullying roles on the rest of the system because they literally feel even more than other parts that they don't cohabitate in the same body, that somehow they're enacting this on someone else, not on themselves. That's the whole thing that fuels them. So starting to do mirror work where you can, consciously be dialoguing with them and having them out when you're literally looking in a mirror to show, like it's that this one body, this one mind is where all of these things exist, making them understand they're part of this, like, this internal family, this system of parts that ultimately all come from one single consciousness, is some of the most powerful stuff that you can do to get them to like really step out of those roles, because it's like irrefutable evidence, like showing them that the face looking at them is not the one they think they're going to see, and showing them that, that there's no, it's not like there's two people standing in the room, it's just one, it's like these, it sounds silly, but it's like this is how, we're dealing with kids, traumatized kids and their imagination. That's the fuel for like how these different parts have these different solidified identities, is they're able to imagine it and embody it, so it comes to, starting to bring them into reality little by little.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. And, that can be a really hard thing for people to understand is the Stockholm syndrome. It's really easy from the outside looking into how you said a relationship that maybe your friend is in where she's with somebody who's very controlling, but she doesn't leave, or she keeps going back every time he cheats on her. It can be really hard to understand the psychology of that, and it can look ridiculous if you're not the type of person that has been conditioned to sort of reduce yourself to doing that. Like you said, to feel safe. If you feel safe in your environment, that's not something that you're going to feel the need to do with somebody. But for people who don't, like you said, there's ways that we can cope with it. It might not be the best coping method, but at the time, like that's all that you can do sometimes if you are in those situations. So being able to understand like the psychology of that, I think helps people move through it. And then also to have compassion. There's a lot of survivors, I think, that get abandoned because they are so conflicted with all of these feelings, and it can be really hard for their support system that they had before they got memories to understand what they're going through in that moment. And it could probably even be hard for them to understand themselves why they have parts of them that want to go run back to the cult, or that miss that old life, or that still feel so attached to their abusers, But when you understand it, like you said, that it's a coping mechanism to sort of be able to survive the situation, because you can't do it if you're just in utter despair and turmoil. You have to figure out like a positive way to, shine a light on it and to like be be able to get through it, or you're not going to, and it's really important that we sort of understand that because, otherwise, again, you're going to have that internal chaos and that conflict and not being able to kind of level with those parts to come together and work together instead of being at odds.
Exactly. And I think that's why like podcasts like yours are so important too, because sometimes people, like you said, they don't have people in their lives that are willing to go with them on this journey or capable emotionally or intellectually, to understand and to contextualize what's going on. So this is like where, your channel is really helpful for me. And I know is really helpful for a lot of survivors is, this is like a community of people that do understand what you're going through, and can share their own experiences with that, so hopefully it's something where even if they're not physically there, it's something that can a support system that can let you know you're not alone. That's so much of what fuels these parts is like they've been convinced, only the abusers and the whole organized abuse system are the only ones that can really understand them, that can really handle them, that can really, it's like, and they've intentionally been created to believe this, but then it's like it does enact in reality sometimes when, we're trying to heal and we're triggering all these parts that are essentially because they don't feel comfortable in our day-to-day reality are intentionally trying to like sabotage and push people away, like you like people. That's why I've always wanted you to do maybe a round table with like myself and my husband and you and Gray and like maybe Nathan Reynolds and his wife or something, just to kind of like show like the amount that partners have to deal, like really annoying things, and like distressing things that partners often have to deal with, where you're dealing with parts of the person that, are trying to like actively sabotage things or are trying to like push you away and stuff because it's how they feel like they need to be, to be safe. And they've been convinced that, that the real life that we actually have, the life that exists outside of the crime is somehow less valuable or fake or just like just another recipe for abandonment, essentially. And so it's it's a lot to deal with, but like I said, like this is why your podcast is so important, for myself and so many survivors. Is like even if you don't actually have these people in your life, there's like a community of people, or even just listening to other people's testimony, it's like it can, if you hear yourself in it, it can go a long way to not feeling so alone in your experience and to understanding that, there is a path forward.
Yeah, and to not carry shame, these are very normal reactions to horrible things. This isn't something that somebody should feel alone with. Coping mechanisms, if you look across the board and listen to these testimonies, they're very similar. You very rarely meet a survivor that didn't or doesn't still have some type of Stockholm syndrome that they're working through, or
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't have a part of them that misses that old life, or that
Mm-hmm.
aligns somehow with the beliefs of the cult, and it doesn't mean that that's what the person's going to do ultimately. That's not the decision that they're going to make to go back or to, go back to their abuser or the cult. But, I think people feel a lot of shame carrying that because they feel that people don't understand how that can be, and it shows like just how ill trauma informed society is to not understand that, because whenever you listen, like it makes perfect sense. Like you said, these are kids, these are children. We're talking to you as an adult, but these things, this conditioning happened to you pretty much from birth, from as far back as you can remember. They were conditioning you to have these beliefs and to be so loyal and aligned that you'd never leave, you'd never feel in control without these people. You wouldn't even want your own agency because you don't even know what life is like to have that because you're so used to having your strings pulled, and you can see how normal these coping mechanisms are. And it's really sad that we've put so much kind of misunderstanding into our conversations and dialogue that survivors actually feel shame for having these very normal reactions to heinous and horrific abuse and conditioning. And so I really appreciate you helping kind of ground us in this and like, show us the background of how these things can happen and why it's not something that you need to feel shame about and that you can actually heal from it, that you can learn why you had that and you can change that belief. You can create a new belief and then you can actually live a life outside of that and not have those, compulsions be so traumatic whenever you feel them that you literally do get up and go back or call your perpetrator because those feelings are so strong, because I know people do that, and I feel like if we gave better support and education, we'd provide more empowering conversations and support to survivors so they felt empowered with those feelings that they had and they could understand and work through it instead of just keeping it to themselves and feeling guilty or alone with them.
Yeah. And something that you mentioned that like is, well, it just made me think of like what is like another like huge important part of like the process of dealing with Stockholm parts, or, any of these parts that are working, feeling like they're working for the abusers and against you, against the system as a whole and everything and your actual wants and needs, is just that you need to give like part of like the ending part of healing these parts is that they need to be given a new job and a new role that still uses their strengths basically. So that's a huge part of it. Like you can't just be like, okay, well, just don't do that anymore. It's like they still have all of this, these different skills or roles that they were taught, so you have to give them an outlet and show them like how their identity does fit into your current identity as a whole. That's a huge part of moving forward in the right direction and ensuring that they're not going to want to, they're going to be given something better than they left, and for me, it really, it depends on the part, 100%, but a lot of parts, because they have their own identities, have their own likes and dislikes, and even hobbies or different things, that maybe are reflected to different, skills that they might have had either internally within the system or externally, and that's how you make these parts allies and move forward. Like you have to figure out, okay, like what is this need that I have and how do I express it in a productive way in my current reality and my current life. That's a huge part of how I'm able to speak out, is that one of my parts that was always totally perpetrator allied, and was meant to be the voice, especially in cult situations, basically, and was supposed to be upbeat and confident and just all of these things, basically, like that, speaking out has given that part of me like a new outlet, a positive one. Like I have so many people that ask when I'm like, that's naysayers actually, that are like, oh, like how could she have gone through these things when she can like talk coherently about them, or like laugh or giggle, or like, have like a coherent way of talking about it and not just be like a puddle of like mush on the floor. And it's like, yeah, if you see me in my flashbacks, that's how I look. But if I'm talking about things, it's because I've processed it to the point that, this part that was literally created by the abusers as part of like my hierarchy to have this role both in trafficking events where I could be conversing intelligently or diplomatically or charmingly, with the client, that we had essentially, or later on in like the hierarchy, like I had talked about, like where they had wanted me to be almost like a um, diplomatic, royalty type role in like the post NWO takeover. It's like this part of me was allowed to have the voice and to feel confident and stuff. And to a degree, my day to day life was a lot of times part of like the shell team that I had, the team of parts that I had to kind of like mask, emotional leak through, and PTSD symptoms and stuff like that, and to present a very, like positive, well spoken, high achieving front, basically. That's where a lot of it, and that's where a lot of it, like me being able to be humorous and all that stuff. It's like it all comes from this part that was intentionally created to have these skills of being able to just like talk to people and to feel like not feel stage fright when I'm here talking to you like an outsider, but then also like, hundreds of other people, It's like a lot of people like it's like that would be very intimidating. And for my normal day-to-day self, that's very intimidating, But this part is like that feels like what they were made for, And so a huge part in me making, solidifying her being fully an ally and not wanting to go back to, you know, when she was created, the only instances that she was really allowed to fully be herself was in cult instances, in trafficking instances and stuff. So we had to like be like, okay, like no, if like, the rest of me is super shy and never like interested in like, really like drawing a ton of attention to myself or all of this kind of stuff. And this part is completely okay with attention and is completely okay with just, being able to be, you know, uh, I don't know, just being able to talk to people, it's like normal day-to-day self was very social anxiety, This part of me isn't. And this is the part of me that, that and I'm much more integrated now. It's like the other parts of me are all kind of here together, but that's like where we came to is she came to this place of understanding and then we were able to like as a team like be like, okay, like we feel this need to advocate and to share our testimony and everything. And she's the part that's like, I'll do it. And it just works even better because it's like, it allows us to talk about things, these things and put them into words essentially.
Yeah, it's really incredible, seeing the different, I know the way that they conditioned is just heinous. However, the way that you're able now as an advocate to use those skills, and that you can take those things and use them for good and use them in the way that you want to, it's really beautiful, and I think that also gives hope to other survivors who just don't know what to do and they have so many strings inside them that are still connected to their abusers and to the cult because they don't know how to take their role, and apply it to their real life. It doesn't make sense. I've even heard some survivors, they're like, this civilian life is just like so boring, I want to go back to
Had
like
that
all the
feeling many times.
yeah. And
Yeah.
it's like you really do. Like you have to find something to fulfill that. You can't just, like you said, take that away from them when that's all that they've known and be like, "Oh, sorry, you just have to like go along with everything and we're not going to fulfill you." I love that you're suggesting that because I think if survivors knew to do that right away, they could immediately start asking, and communicating with those parts and seeing what types of, what other outlets that they could do instead, even if that is like exercise. I know you've brought that up before in a different episode, speaking and advocating. And, there's so many different ways that you can use these things now for good. And I think that it's just so empowering to see, you and others learning to do that, and showing other survivors that you don't have to use your gifts and skills that you were, manipulated to have in a way that serves them. Like you can now take those things and like you said, turn the weapon around on them and use it against them now, and use it in ways that you were intended to use them, use your gifts in a way that serves humanity and that you can live with positively instead of all the ways that they were forcing you to use them in ways that you didn't, consent to and that might not have been in your best interest or that you might not have chosen to use them for had you had free will and a choice to do what you wanted with those gifts. So it's really neat. And you are just a brilliant speaker. That's been another really cool thing is watching you develop that and watching you go on all these different podcasts and start your own videos. It's really neat watching you like hone that skill and use it for something that's been so empowering for so many people and that so many people have embraced and you've changed people's lives through being able to do this.
Oh, that's all I hope is I could help like at least like one person, that's also going through this stuff. And it's like, it's part of what keeps me going with all of this stuff and the late nights like we have right now and everything, just to, keep moving forward, and something I would say to follow on that is like, you can even look at, let your violence trained parts, because that's going to be a lot of like, people dealing with persecutor parts that were, forced to enact violence or stuff like that. And obviously we don't want to actually enact violence on people, but one of the main things that's really important in healing is like venting, for example. So if you want, get yourself a punching bag, get yourself a universal bob. If you can only have a few pillows around that you can just like visualize, like with that, is like, if you have parts that were trained to deal with their emotions through violence, like sometimes you just have to vent, allow them to vent in the way they know how, in a way that isn't going to harm you or harm someone else. And then the other side of that is like, you can allow those parts that were, you know, like trained in those ways to see that you're now doing that, but not for a handler, but for yourself, and it can allow you to then move through the world like feeling more confident in your ability to face any physical threats that you may experience, in your day-to-day life or something, and it's like, that was a huge part for some of my parts, is like they were trained to be a little child bodyguard for fucking Gates, and like, so training them in, or creating in them like an understanding that that training that they had could then be used to like now protect us from our abusers, was like a huge way of not just empowering us as a whole, but especially those parts, because they were seeing that, that there was a way to, still be themselves, their levels of, awareness, or, reflexes, or, being comfortable with like weapons, or it sounds absurd still talking about it, but it's like just the reality of it, that it can, it can be it can be easy to just push that stuff away and be like, I never want to think about that. But it's way more productive to be like, okay, like, if these parts have this, then that's what we need to deal with. And you mentioned too with the feeling of, like, oh, you're kind of addicted to adrenaline with your occult parts, because that's like what they're acclimated to, is like adrenalized like circumstances and everything. So day-to-day life for them is boring, is like, I mean, and they do feel very like misunderstood by, it's like a lot of soldiers come back from war, and that's just for like a few years compared to like what a lot of us have gone through, in our childhoods. But they come back from war feeling completely isolated or disconnected from like coming back to normal life, because they've seen things that other people can't even imagine. They've been part of things that other people can't even imagine, and they feel almost like more comfortable when they have a very concrete threat to deal with than understand, going back to like the nuances of like relationships and all this kind of stuff. So that's another reason that your podcast is so important, is because on a certain level, you are never truly going to be understood by people that haven't been through the same stuff. So being able to, that was a huge part of our roundtables we did with like Gray and Nathan Reynolds. Like that was part of why that was so healing to me, is to feel like, like you just like on a certain level understood by people, because they had been through such similar crap, and they went through the same struggles and still had the same struggles to a degree of like being like, those parts feeling uncomfortable in normal life, but very comfortable in high stakes situations.
Absolutely. And I know we still have a couple more pictures to go through, but I had one more question sort of along these lines that was submitted by one of the mods on my channel, Jay, who I absolutely love. He had a great question about triggers, and if you personally encounter potential triggers in everyday life while out and about, whether it be colors, objects, words, etc. If so, how does this bring on any symptoms like anxiety, feelings of potential switching into alters taking place? And then how do you handle triggers when they come up?
Yeah, I mean, luckily I've, I mean, there was a time, yes, where I was experiencing that more, essentially. I mean, it's characterized by having the amnesia. If you have like these parts that are still, behind these amnesic barriers, then you're much more susceptible to triggers, and for me it was usually like phrases or hand signals, basically. Um, and essentially, I mean, it the it's hard to describe because when you're dealing with like a full switch, like that's how it's defined, is like, your day-to-day consciousness shuts off, and the other consciousness takes over. So in like nowadays especially, but even then it's like a lot of times you'll have the feeling of like waking up from a sleep, that it's like it's not you don't it's not so easy to pinpoint the point at which you fell asleep the previous night, you know what I mean? Like that's like non-existent, but the point at which you wake up is like what you can remember, okay, I'm now here in this body, it's morning time, etc. um, that's the same. So if you're switching from like your day-to-day consciousness into one of your cult, being triggered into one of your like cult allied parts, for example, then that's going to be the experience the cult allied part has. When the consciousness switches, it's going to be, they're going to have the feeling of waking up, essentially, because they haven't been in the body for your day-to-day self. So they're not necessarily going to remember the specific switch or what it was like, but all they're going to know is now they're holding the body, basically. So um recognizing it is usually comes down to like starting. I mean, it's hard to describe because it's like there's just this point that you get to where you're not having full switches, essentially, and you can have a certain level of like co-consciousness, and that will be like an awareness of an uncomfortableness and it's kind of like a sudden appearance of a new voice in your consciousness, like sudden new urges. And once you get to a point in healing, like you're going to recognize this, you're going to be mindful, you're going to be like, hey, all of a sudden I'm dealing with XYZ, that wasn't the same as a little bit ago, basically. Um, so I mean, I haven't really had any like color things. I've had like harmonic and like tone stuff. Like I said, most of the time for me it was keyed towards like hand signals, or phrases, basically. But also it's like, just even into my therapist's office, because when we tried to do EMDR, a lot of times like I couldn't because it was so similar to when I was dealing with um, like hypnotically induced trances or switching, just the proximity of like my body and his body and the positions we were in. It would be accompanied with like feeling like I was drifting away, drifting off to sleep, having almost starting to like float out of my body, basically, but it was something that, I recognized and like, essentially would like put a stop to the situation for that reason, because it's like there would be this knowledge that I was about to lose consciousness. But in general, most of them, that's unfortunately, you know, what it's what it's like, is like there isn't, if a switch, sorry, if a switch is going to happen, like there isn't like a whole, and you're still in the point where you have, these program responses, there isn't a whole lot you can do to stop it. It's more about being really aware of your surroundings and kind of preventing it, basically. I don't know if that makes sense, but if you feel uncomfortable around certain people, or you feel certain, like, just know that certain urges don't feel right for yourself, then remove yourself from that situation, turn off that song, like you have to, like, that it's only an awareness that comes through healing, is getting better at recognizing what your triggers are. And yeah, and it was something I was still dealing with, up until like a couple years ago, was having handlers in my life that were trying to essentially trigger me through different, different stuff, and had previously been able to trigger me into full switches. But then as I healed and I, gave more credence to the things that I was actually feeling around certain people, and wasn't going into the denial and gaslighting program that was like, knew that there was part of me knew this, there was a handler in my life, and I was consciously like, you're overreacting to this person. There's no reason you should be feeling this way, like this is, there's all these different things that are put there intentionally to make you, you know, be amnesiac of the person's role in your life, but a lot of times if you're in healing, like you will have indications of this stuff, and we're just used to not paying attention. We've just spent our whole lives not paying attention to our actual reality and our actual emotions around situations and people. And that's a lot of what comes in healing, is you have to start trusting yourself. You have to start, you have feelings around someone, you start asking the questions in the system. You have to be like, why is it I feel this way about this person? And you'll start getting answers, especially if you're persistent about it. um it made me always, the denial stuff made me be like, oh, I'm just being like paranoid and stuff. But then it's like I could come in with a conversation and be like, well, but I don't feel this way about every guy. I don't feel this way about every person. It's like, so there's a reason that I'm feeling this way about this person. And later on in healing, it's like I was able to like regain the amnesia, not just of like the handler's like role in my past of him working with Gates, but was also able to recall like in, more present reality, how he had been a fixture in my life. He was a tattoo client, for example, like a regular one that would just, come from time to time. And then dealing with the amnesia coming back of the times in the tattoo studio that he had triggered me, and that I had had this period of time where I was amnesiac to, and like, or had been triggered to do different things. Basically, most of the handlers in my life were, in my adulthood, were tattoo clients. Basically, they were people that like, had a valid reason to be in my life, and to be close to me, and and interacting with me and everything. Like it was, and that was like a huge part to getting to becoming safe and to not being triggered anymore, was finally dealing with my emotions and my understanding around different people, and being like, I'm not, I'm not suspect of all of my fucking tattoo clients. It's like, but these few people are, I have these feelings around. And once you get to the point of your healing that you're actually going to be investigating them, that's when you'll start finding, that maybe there are people in your life that shouldn't have been. Prior to the Paris event, that was a different tattoo a client, basically, like that. And once I really dealt with, and basically she had triggered me, into, performing a mock sacrifice on a kitten prior to me actually being like taken to Paris, essentially, or choosing to fly myself and my mom to Paris for this ritual, to basically make sure that I could be triggered, that those parts were still intact, would still respond essentially to the cues, and would perform the roles, the butcher type roles that they had been trained into, essentially. Um, so, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's, it's crazy, and the other one too, it's like you would, to ensure a certain program was intact, you would, trigger a certain part, and then that part would respond by, being told to like leave a token, like one of my necklaces or something, in a specific area outside of my building, essentially. And this is like memories that came back once I dealt with, really understanding this person was like a handler. And then the next time he would see me for an appointment, he would like return the necklace, basically. Like, so weird, it's weird shit, but it's all stuff for them that ensures that certain amnesic walls are still there. If you're still willing to continue seeing a handler in your life, most likely you're still amnesiac to the fact that they are a handler. But yeah, I don't know if that that'll make sense, but that's at least been my experience with it.
Yes, no, that was very helpful. I think like this type of thing can be very, very difficult for survivors to navigate in understanding what could potentially trigger them, and then being able to navigate. I love how you said, it's not necessarily always just problem solving in the moment, but having a preparation beforehand, knowing how to prevent this, being aware of what these things are, being aware of being your own private investigator, and then also having the ability to ask questions about your environment and to like really look at everything with a critical eye instead of just assuming, you don't want to be so paranoid with everything that it's like debilitating, but to be able to look at your surroundings, the people that are you're constantly interacting with. If you have clients in a job where you're interacting with the same people or you have repeating clients, to be able to look at those things with a critical eye and see what is safe or what could possibly be interfering with your safety unbeknownst to you. And I think having that sort of preparation can be really helpful in avoiding being triggered like you've been able to do, by being aware of what your triggers are and what the things are that what the ways are, I should say, that the cult could be trying to interfere with your life and where they're kind of like sneaking in. And that's really amazing that you were able to identify all of that, because I'm sure that they thought that they would get away with it, and be able to keep being a part of your life and kind of like pushing themselves in there, and it was probably very devastating to them, that you figured all that out and were able to navigate away from it. But ultimately, that's what we want for every survivor to be able to do is find those little chinks in their armor in a sense where they're able to have interference come in that's not safe for them and to be able to mend that and be able to see it and prevent it from coming in again, and have that
Yeah.
fence up and that guard up without being so paranoid, and just feeling empowered with that and feeling like they can navigate that if and when it comes their way instead of either being oblivious to it or just being super fearful of it. So that's really, really powerful. And it's a really common thing. And I think that was a good question, to ask. And I really appreciate you taking the time to answer that.
Yeah, I still think the main thing to take away from that is like you have to validate your emotions. Like if any part is having emotions or, sketchiness around environments, places, dates, people, like you really like you have to get out of the habit of like talking yourself out of acknowledging that stuff and you have to get in the habit of
Yes.
exploring it. Yeah, because for me, like where I'm at in healing and being free of a lot of amnesia and understanding like most of like my life story and all of the different things that happened that it's like hindsight's 2020 is like I can look back on all the different ways that I was like facilitating abuser access by these parts that were playing the roles of essentially like talking us out of the feelings that we were feeling around certain things and like that's my biggest like hindsight and wish that it's like, oh, I wish it would have come sooner, but things happen the way they're supposed to, is like just recognizing, like looking back and recognizing, like, oh, like I, from the beginning, knew that there was an issue here, but I just didn't want to really, I just didn't want to really like look at it or ask the questions. And a lot of times too, it's kind of like going back to that graph. It's because we just haven't had the context yet to give these like these emotions, these feelings around these people, um, just we just haven't had the context, for what these people could be, their roles in our lives. Um, but yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. And speaking of graphs, did you want me to bring up that second one that you had written out?
Um, sure. Yeah, that
I
one
didn't know if that's
was
the order you wanted to go in, but I know
yeah,
that
yeah.
I had some information that sort of went with what we were just talking about.
Yeah, I mean, so that's like an example of like a programming chain that I've dealt with. Sorry, I'm trying to find it in my notes here because it's probably not going to be something that most people are going to be able to read on the screen. So I was planning on just I'm probably just reading it because I feel like it's fairly so here it is. I feel like it's fairly self-explanatory, but this is kind of like how I've been talking about many times when we're going through these different barriers and having to encounter gatekeepers that it's like, it's like it became predictable the symptoms that I would start having, the punishment or like, the self-harm stuff basically. Um, so I'm just going to kind of like read through like what the programming chain was, is that anytime it starts with unauthorized access. So anytime that I was trying to process information that was seen as off limits, put as off limits by my abusers, I would have like, my denial part essentially, would be the first one to show up, and they would essentially be like an immediate like gaslighting and denial of like any of the unauthorized bleed through as you're paranoid, you're crazy, you're over imaginative, etc. If and then if I was still persisting, usually it would be followed by like an emotional block or cutoff where it would almost like go from experiencing all of the emotions of the flashback, or the emotions of the part I was trying to process essentially. And you instead just get completely numbed to where you feel no emotion, and then so it's almost like another like barrier that you experience to keep you from processing that information. And it would be followed by, if I was still persisting, trying to still journal about stuff, etc., by like a full system lockout, basically, where it felt like there was, more, it's almost like denial to the point where you're like, I don't have any parts, and it's almost like the feeling, the communication between different parts has been like essentially like shut off. So another thing to, dissuade you from pursuing that path at all. And then it would essentially like progress into this cycle essentially, where it's like it goes through some different psychological symptoms that I would start having, as well as like physical ones, which are usually like both from trauma or torture memories. So it essentially start with depression and feelings of hopelessness, accompanied by like nausea, like chronic nausea and joint pain. I think a lot of times this is like where this internalized trauma is like where so many survivors deal with like fibromyalgia and different things like this. Like when I was at the beginning of dealing with my healing, I was, on track to be diagnosed with fibromyalgia because of all the widespread pain that I had. But a lot of it was just triggered, it's something that's luckily gone away because it was all internalized, this internalized stuff that I hadn't processed. And once you process it, you're able to, to have it be less common, and not chronic. Although each time I'm dealing with a gatekeeper part, it's still something I do deal with for at least for a very limited amount of time. But it's like it will usually, dealing processing memories usually comes with maybe body memory specific to that memory, but it'll also be accompanied with all of this kind of punishment programming where it's like it'll be the fibromyalgia pain, the like widespread, joint pain, basically, especially like lower back, and like like knees and like ankles for me, and then like really chronic nausea, basically. So, and it's just something that I've like gotten used to like recognizing as part of the thing that makes me know something's coming up. And it also has like shortened, though. It's not like chronic anymore. It'll be like a day that I'm dealing with it, and then I'll just do the journaling and then those things will subside. Um, so it progresses from like that area to it's like you go into like more dissociative state, so it's like you feel like not, it's kind of more the depersonalization, derealization stuff to where it's like you don't feel present in your life, you don't feel present in your body, you just don't, feel like everything's like not real. Um, and then that progresses into what starts um, coming into like the fuel of like self-harm or self-destruct kind of programming, so like uh feelings of like worthlessness or like you might as well die, which leads you to believe that you're crazy and that you can't function. And then, but it feels like, because you're blocked out of the system, like you have no context. You feel like there's no reason for it. You never went through trauma. So I'm just, you're just crazy. You're just paranoid, basically. And then there was like followed by that was like the runaway or come home programming to a base or institution, basically. And this is like kind of like a continuous cycle where you would be dealing with all of these things like over and over. Usually as like, this is like the booby traps that I personally experienced, but other survivors might aspects of this anytime they're dealing with new memory content they're trying to process, basically. And then it just progresses into it's like each time it goes a revolution of all of these different things to dissuade me. If I'm still trying to process things, it's like each time you cycle through these programs, you have like another thing added on, basically, to like amp up the intensity. So like the first time you go through that cycle I had just talked about, if you're still asking questions, after the first round, other programs are added after each round. So the second one would be like addiction and distraction. So that starts getting introduced into the mix where, you're trying to do anything other than focus on the healing, so you self-soothe with like addictions and like turn away or mute the emotions like knowingly using like an outside source. The third revolution for me is if I'm still persisting, I start dealing with workaholism and obsession, so it's like an addiction to busyness, basically, and like an escape in activities and goals, so it's like another layer of like distraction, basically. Um, and this is all obviously stuff that's just trying to get the survivor to stop putting energy into healing. Number four was the fourth revolution would be, flooding and overwhelm. So given emotions and pain of like torture and body memories that are really ramped up in the intensity. So you choose to look away or run from the content because you feel overwhelmed by physical or emotional pain. Um, Number five would be if you're still continuing and creating acknowledgement consciously, conscious acknowledgement of the trauma or sharing it with others, then I would deal with the Jesus rape memory, basically. So it was like emotions, like it was the core split time where I had been like raped and then they brought Jesus in to, for me to confess, everything I was feeling, all the trauma, and then for him to tell me I was lying, like a liar and like worthless and all of this different stuff. And then he raped me with like a crucifix, basically. So it was essentially like, it's weaponizing a specific memory that they knew was very powerful and very early on to dissuade me from, to like create emotions that would like reinforce the cycle steps and like create like physical pain, like body memories to punish, so I'd have body memories and being raped, basically. Regardless of what the memory was I was trying to process, I would also be dealing with this memory like every single time, basically as like a barrier to healing. And then number six would be having like, panic attacks or like feeling like you can't breathe, essentially, so, this feeling of like, of overwhelming anxiety and terror and not being able to, feeling like you're dying because you can't breathe, basically. And then the last one would be like this second layer of suicidal ideation. So flashes of seeing death as the first round was seeing like yourself as like worthless and like unredeemable, and this one is more about almost like death is freedom or like no big deal, like just kind of like making it seem like the inevitable like conclusion, to your life or to getting some freedom from all of this stuff I just described, because you're going through, you know, the torture of having to deal with the memory, but you're also dealing with all of these different programs that are there to compound the difficulty, and make you want to give up either healing or just give up on life in general. So I don't know if that gives someone like insight onto like how the different programs can like work together, but also are like programmed into a very like predictable and like methodical way. It won't be the same for all survivors. And, like, it won't take the same steps or use the same programs, but most likely if they are dealing with like manipulated dissociation, they will be dealing with some sort of like programming loops or chains that essentially are intentionally put there to, facilitate the gatekeepers in keeping those barriers there.
Thanks for putting this together and explaining all of that. That's actually really helpful to look at it this way. Again, I think if there's survivors looking at this, especially ones that are newer to waking up, it probably makes a lot of sense to have this in some type of order because the stuff probably seems very random and sporadic, versus sort of a system that kind of goes off one step at a time on purpose because of conditioning. And I also really love how you added in addiction and workaholism and some of these other things. I, for the longest time, didn't understand alcoholism, addiction, workaholism, these different sort of issues that interfere in people's lives. You kind of think like, why would somebody do that to themselves or make that choice, And very seldom do we tie that to trauma. And I think being able to identify that can help people avoid falling into those traps. And then if they're in that trap, to sort of reflect and say, is this a side effect of something that I went through versus something random that I'm doing, to self-sabotage or to escape?
Yeah.
Um, and I think that it's a really important piece of the puzzle, looking at that and being able to um, sort of get the control back of these ways that we kind of pull away from healing, and to also not fall into these traps that are really there by design to keep you from, getting to where you need to be. Addiction is a much better place for you to be in to the cult than for you to be exercising and eating healthy and having a clear mind and healing. They would love to see you first become addicted to something and, self-sabotage, lose your job, become homeless, and oh, you have to call them and you're relying on them again, and or if you are working and have your life together in a way for you to all of a sudden become obsessed with escaping from having silence and alone time and being able to actually spend time healing and processing. And of course, the flooding, we hear that all the time, the ways that type of thing um, will suddenly come in somebody's life and how debilitating that can be. But I appreciate you putting this together. It helps looking at it from these contexts to be able to make sense of it. That way, when things happen or the suicidal ideations and panic attacks, we can look at it from kind of a systematized way of something deliberate that's supposed to happen, and separate ourselves from the emotion of it and actually deal with it as a side effect versus something that we feel is totally out of our control. And this is I like the little graph that you made too with the circle and the different steps. I think a lot of people also be able to relate to that as well.
Yeah, like I said, it's going to be unique to every survivor, but also all of
Yes.
these symptoms are like super common
They
also,
are. We hear it over and
for
over again.
them
Yes,
to deal with.
absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
And while I have this up, did you want to go through the photos that we have next?
Yeah, I think that would be a good way to kind of like round out this episode. So maybe to give people some like insight, this is probably where I'll say like, more of a trigger warning because like we've been talking more in generalities and this is like a particular um memory around how like one or three of like my main gatekeepers were created essentially. Um and that was first, I'm actually going to show you something that's like in this journal that I didn't send to you. But it's essentially like I don't know how many of viewers like recall like when I talk about like how the butcher part was created, and like it was my time in the kennel dealing with a lot of training and you know uh basically still resisting being like able to like kill like an animal or a person basically. And Gates was incredibly frustrated, and Mistress Diana, who was the female cult trainer, was like kind of like out of options for trying to, because she was the one that was responsible in training me for like the occult, like the ritual butcher kind of role. And they created a scenario basically where I was taken out to, taken to an area joining the kennel area, like a had like a picnic bench and stuff, and was, um, you know, sorry, this is why it's trigger warning, but was given an they brought a dog in a cage out there too, and they basically were gave me the knife, one of the ritual knives, and told me to kill the dog. And I was, because I had been resisting up to that point, I still resisted, said I wouldn't do it, and then they proceeded to to pull the dog out of the kennel and douse him in like lighter fluid, and then set him on fire, so he was, running around and, like screaming and stuff like that. And you can imagine how traumatizing that was. But, eventually the dog like falls over and is like almost dead, and they walk me over to the dog and essentially put the knife in my hand, or like kill the dog, basically. And for me, that was a huge part of like solidifying that, for my butcher parts, that's like what created the final like split, to where there was a part of me that was willing then to do the dirty work that they wanted me to, because I had come to an understanding that there wasn't any option of resistance, that if they decided someone or something was going to die, that it was going to happen one way or another. And me refusing to was just going to make things worse, like it was going to postpone the inevitable, but make it way worse than it could have been if I just did it quickly and cleanly and the way I was supposed to, essentially. Um, this was kind of almost like immediately following this, is that he was pissed that he had to go through this scenario at all with me, and that I had been resisting. And I had mentioned there were two other boys being trained in the kennel as well, with me at the time, and they had their own handlers, but we're going through the same, like wolf and dog, like perpetrator alter type stuff and hunter type stuff, that essentially like I had at some point been like, you feel more confident a lot of times when you're in these perpetrator alters, because you feel like you're a wolf, or you feel like you're a soldier or whatever. And it was kind of that part, realizing that like maybe we could get free, we could run away, and we could like live in the woods or something, like, and it felt like a feasible option. And like I had just been at one point like just discussing this with the two boys. We were rarely left alone, but it was like a point that we had been hunting like on like a training thing, and I just like brought it up to them, and then they proceeded to go tell, their handlers basically, and then they told Gates, obviously. So it was the combination of these things that like, was his reasoning for why I was going to go through like the following memory, was that, he was trying to decide whether I was worth keeping at all, or like whether or not I was going to be able to be trained into what he wanted, or whether he should just get rid of me, and there was a lot of basically, getting thrown in his car and being driven to from the kennel to the bunker area. Both of these, I think, were outside of San Antonio, um, Texas, like not too far, but in more remote areas, basically. And so I was driven to the bunker, which I had been like many times before. And the whole way he was basically telling me that like, I was worthless, and that he was going to throw me away, and that, I wasn't performing the way I was supposed to. So I was expendable, all of this different stuff. And, we ended up at like the bunker, and it's hard to describe to people how, if I was in a cult part that was comfortable there, I was excited to be there. But if I was in any other part, there was a complete recognition that it's like you can't even understand like how hopeless you feel when you get to like the elevator of like a bunker and you know you're going to be like hundreds of feet underground and there's like one way in and one way out and you're a kid, it's like there's not even like a pretend of escape, and all the horrors that happen there, and you always want to be on the good side because you've seen the horrible things that can happen there, essentially. And so it was, begging for my life basically, and then being brought to like was essentially like their waste disposal room, like pretty low down. Like there was a lot of different areas there, but this particular area was like one of the lower areas that had like just, it was like concrete. It was like, just concrete hallways. Essentially, it was like very utilitarian. And then being brought to a room that was like seen as like the waste disposal room. It had like basically like it was a large room with like a dirt floor. There were two guys in like hazmat suits basically like waiting for me, and there was this basically like this kind of shape. I'm gonna try and hold it up. I can also send it to you. I'm just realizing because there's like a shadow on there, you probably can't even really see it. Whoa.
I just took off my view that way we could see you better.
Hmm. I don't know how to not get this shadow on here right now. Oh, well, you can kind of see
You
it
can
there.
see it
I'll
good.
just I'll just send you the thing. So basically, like a doorway is like the guys in the hazmat suits, like myself, is here. But there was basically this hole, like structure in the ground where it was almost like a big funnel, essentially. Like it was like four-sided, like upside down, like pyramid. Hole in the ground, and at the bottom of it was kind of like a square like tube, essentially. And then in the bottom of that there was like a small square hole, essentially, that was at the floor, I guess, of that tube. um so, and then above it was hanging this like super large uh it's not a cylinder because it's a cube, but it was meant to essentially fit like perfectly into this bottom portion here. And it was a place where they would basically dump whatever they wanted, trash or like, human remains or whatever. And like it was, so you throw it down into this funnel, and then that large that large, I don't even know what to call, rectangle was like three-dimensional. I'm like, oh, my brain's not working right now. In any case, it's like it fit perfectly into that bottom thing. So it would be like raised and lowered like repeatedly, essentially, to like smash whatever was in that like tube down through that hole that's like in the bottom, basically. So they like threw me, but I also think that maybe it's less practical and this is just a programming device too. I don't really know. You know what I mean? But this is what I was told, was that this was the spot where like they put all the trash, and that I was trash, and that, that I was like irredeemable. And they, threw me in that. In the bottom, it was like empty. I was standing on like either side of the hole that was, part of the floor, essentially. And, was basically told that they could throw anything on me, like down there, and that it's like they could make it like hot or cold, or like, throw bugs on me. And that's what they did first, was throw like, cockroaches and like centipedes on me, which, I just tried to like squish, and a lot of them just ran out of the hole like too, because they're fucking bugs. And then, was followed by them essentially, it's like creating really, really hot, like the sides of it were iron, essentially like rusted iron is like what the structure was made of. And they became like super hot to the point where like the bottoms of my shoes were starting to get like soft, and it's like I almost passed out from the heat. But then it's like my elbow brushed the side, and it like burned me and like woke, like essentially like, like woke me up. And then they followed that by, making it super cold. And it's like I was trying to crouch down and keep myself warm in like a fetal position, but I couldn't, because it's like it was so close to my dimensions. It's like I didn't really have room, essentially, to do that. And that basically, after he said he was like done having his fun, that he was like, all right, now I'm just gonna like throw you away. and that the hazmat people came through and they started taking these like wheelbarrows that had human body parts in them essentially and just like emptying them into the hole essentially and like trying to like I don't know bury me in corpses. It's like it's so over the top and disgusting and like ridiculous, and it was just the feeling of like of panic because they have all these things following me. People don't realize, it's like you see horror movies and you see limbs and shit like that. It's like that shit's hard. Like this is like you have bones inside of there. And like so it was just dealing with like just trying to survive, just trying to scramble on top of all of this stuff. That's like what that first image is there was like some journaling of that experience basically of it's just them the three whatchamacallit at the top and then just throwing all of these pieces of corpses on me essentially. It was all pretty much arms and legs, but in one of like the wheelbarrow loads there was like a baby that was not quite dead even, and it's like it's like it was partially buried already in his stuff and I tried to grab it, but then it just got buried under more stuff. So it was just like that I was just, it kept getting fuller and I was just trying to like stay ahead of being able to climb on top of all these things so I didn't get buried in them basically. And once it was like pretty much full and I was like, I was to where I could like see where they were standing and everything, but I still it wasn't high enough for me to climb out or anything. This Gates got like this smile on his face and was like, I guess you're worth something after all, basically, because, I had survived or whatever, you know what I mean? Um, and made me, beg for my life again and promise to like always obey and never to do anything wrong and all of this different shit because, like survivors are many times often put in situations where they feel like they're facing certain death, you know what I mean? And you you get willing to do anything not to, be dealing with that, so yeah, so I essentially got hoisted out of the hole, and was like essentially, like exhausted. It's like I couldn't even like really like move, but I was like begging at his feet. And like then you have the feeling of like being picked up by him. And it's like for all the loyalty parts, it's like, the feeling of being picked up by your handler is like just like overwhelming like comfort and like safety and stuff. And to go from like how I had been feeling a few minutes earlier, it's like it really reinforces those loyalty feelings and those trauma bonding, that's a trauma attachment kind of feelings. And, was essentially carried by him, out of the room to another room. And that's like the next slide there where the other one, that one there. Yeah. Where it's like he was, basically I was told, like had many times before that I had, I was chosen by the goddess and I had been saved by her, and deemed worthy and all this like bullshit. So it's like he brought me to this, there was a few different like shrine rooms in the bunker. He brought me to a different level to like a shrine room and, had me like kneeling in front of this like three goddess like bronze statue basically, and was just repeating over and over like programming script shit where it was just, this is who saved you, but this is also your identity, this is like, this is why you're allowed to live, is because this is what you embody, yada yada. um and basically, I swear my loyalty and all this stuff, say all the things that he expects me to say, essentially. And then I got brought from there to the next location. So basically, three, these, this triple goddess was the identities that would become the gatekeepers for the whole system and would be essentially enforcing the barriers between my day-to-day life and then the cult and trauma memory stuff. And I had just gone through all of this stuff to basically solidify that these would be parts that would be willing to do anything for Gates, and we're 100%, invested in that, and because you're dealing with like a lot of suggestibility and everything, you're dealing with, just those trauma parts. Once they're split, you can really convince them of anything. And that's like where I was at after all of that, is that I was convinced that the gatekeeper parts had this identity. They saw themselves as outside of this body, somewhat supernatural, you know what I mean, and saw themselves as enacting stuff on the rest of the system, but not that they themselves were part of it. And then they just solidified all this with like he brought me to like it was like a hospital type room, which both gave me some relief from like the physical pain that I was feeling and emotional through like, administering drugs and injections, but then proceeded to like follow that up with essentially the splitting of that part through I think it was mostly through like kind of harmonic entrainment into three different parts. So it was both a single part, but it also had like, it was like almost like three sisters, basically. Same name, but it was like A, B, and C. And each of, the main one had the role of gatekeeping the whole cult system. One of them had the role of gatekeeping all of the military training and stuff, all the violence stuff. And then the other one had the role of gatekeeping all of the ritual and like more occult magic-y type stuff. So essentially and they were seen as like a team that would work together. And basically, it was this consciousness through drugging and harmonics like split into three essentially, and then they would like administer pain type drugs that were basically, I was told to like separate the three of them, and then would experience a lot of pain. So it was like it reinforced this idea that there were three parts that were going to work in tandem for the same goal, and that they would never try and like split or heal or work against each other. So it sounds outlandish and confusing and stuff, but this is like why I wanted to share it, is like this is just like for three of my gatekeepers. This is like the whole process essentially that like we went through, and like the multiple levels of like trauma and scripting and convincing, and then really kind of sealing everything with like electronic, harmonic drugging, all of this kind of stuff, basically to really solidify those identities and their roles in my head. And then this is like 6 years old. So
Yes.
it's like it's very early on, and then they can, they have these parts with these roles, and then they can continue the trauma, and they can know that they have the access to these parts, but that also these parts are going to be, you know, are going to be maintaining all the walls that they want, then forward, and that's also part of why it was continuing to be used, is because they were able to train these parts. I was able to dissociate, these traumas and stuff, and they were able to continue to to split more parts and train more parts and use me for essentially whatever he wanted me to be used for, essentially. So, um, yeah, that's I don't know. I just wanted to give that, I guess, as like, yeah, like an example of like why we need to be compassionate, why it's a lot of times so hard to get to these hierarchy parts, why it's so hard to get to the gatekeeper parts and to understand their experiences. Like in my experience, like all of your hierarchy parts and gatekeeper parts, like they really have gone through some of your like most intense traumas essentially. And that's why, despite how, we can easily in healing get frustrated, I think, with our gatekeeper parts, and we can easily get frustrated with our persecutor parts. We can easily be like I just want to know everything. Just tell me everything. And on a certain level, like we have to acknowledge that we're, if things are being held back, it's for a reason. It's because we haven't really dealt with the parts that we need to, but it's also we have to recognize that, that maybe it hasn't been time yet to deal with this stuff. So that's where it's like I think it's a common experience with a lot of people that they once they start healing their trauma and knowing that there's more, they can almost want to like push too much or rush too much into it, and processing these memories takes a lot of time and energy. And like I think being slow and persistent and really like listening to yourself is really the best way to go, and like minimizing judgment, minimizing frustration, and just really, trying to come to a place of like understanding. Because a lot of times in my experience, like, I'm like, oh, the memories can't get any worse, but then once you start dealing with like hierarchy parts or different stuff, it's like, oh yeah, like there was worse shit that could have that happened to me and everything. And you just have to, you have to be in a place that you can handle it, and be in a place that you can handle living through serious destabilization to get to the other side. That's kind of what I was talking about before, just when you're dealing with the suicide stuff. You shouldn't really be like fully trying to process, super resistant gatekeepers or super resistant persecutor parts until you've come up with your own way of being able to like manage these flashbacks and these intense emotions, because that is what you're going to be dealing with. And so it's like it's I just want to encourage everyone that like you got to do what you can to stay grounded and to like vent and to get things out and to express them, and writing and visuals and whatever you need to, and talking to people and using all of your support system, because you have to on a certain level make peace with the fact that you are going to be destabilized when you're making big steps in healing. And you have to be able to weather that storm to get through to the other side, and just try not to bite off more than you can chew. Just listen to your system and your body. And yeah.
Man, seeing the art paired with your stories, it just makes it all hit different. It's so hard to hear it. And whenever you see these really creative and artistic drawings that you do that depict these events, it is just like it's so unfathomable thinking about the lengths that these people go. I mean, setting that up, having men waiting there for you, a 6-year-old child in hazmats with wheelbarrows of body parts. I mean, the scenarios that are set up, it is no joke, the lengths that they go and the effort and the time and the money, that they put into creating a compliant, obedient, and loyal child that will not leave. At least that's their hope. They want you loyal forever. It's just, I mean, I can see why people have such a hard time grasping this, because if you're not a psychopath, it's really hard to think about putting that much effort into manipulating a little child. I mean, these adults
And
have,
they enjoy it too, like
yeah, you're saying he's up there smiling at you, like enjoying watching you, in this just absolutely horrific situation. And Gates is up there, smiling at you and like laughing and like chuckling. Like, I mean, it is just, I'm so sorry that you had to go through that. I can't even imagine remembering that. I can't imagine going through it. It makes me so sad thinking about you as a little child going through that, any child. And then to think that there's children today that are going through these types of scenarios, it's so horrific. And to think about people getting off on that and that they're, excited to do this to little vulnerable beings, it's just, it's beyond anything, but that was a really great example of showing how these different layers are created, and to think about it puts it into perspective, these parts that can be so outcasted or misunderstood by you or by people in your life. You think about what they went through, and it's like, who wouldn't be like an asshole, or like if you've gone through all that, like these parts really did have to like endure like the worst of things, and we're so grateful for those parts because of that, and hopefully society can kind of catch up and, help create a more accepting world for and space for these parts to be able to have a voice and to be able to share what they went through and to not be persecuted, for having to be a persecutor or a gatekeeper. but you really see like the effort that they put into programming a child, and how that could solidify so much within, just from that one event. And you've shared so many on this show, and I'm sure that's only like a little portion of the big picture of everything that you've went through, but just just seeing the effort that they go into planning all of this, and that everything is so pre-planned, and it's not what they show us in movies where there's just like these random events that happen. This is like very, very organized and systematized and so much effort. And, just thinking about like, where do people get wheelbarrows full of body parts? And like what in the hell? It's
Yeah,
so,
I'm pretty sure it was probably people from like the
oh,
adrenochrome like because that's one of the things I had been shown there, was like almost like an adrenochrome factory type situation where it was just people, like a lot of them like look like, Mexican like illegals and shit like that, like it wasn't all kids, a lot of it was adults, but it was like just like a room that was, people just on, torture tables and, having their blood harvested. And you're going to have, that's kind of the only thing that ever made sense to me. I've never understood why it was like just arms and legs, was fucked up to say. I'm like, maybe they had a use for like the rest of them. I don't even know. Like, it was so strange to me. Like, or maybe that would have done too much damage to me. But it's like, it's like trying to figure out the rhyme or reason of a lot of these things is something that I'm like, I don't
or
like,
organ
does it even matter?
harvesting.
Um,
Yeah, it's so bizarre. Was this bunker that you went to, was it kind of like, is it, I know, I'm sure it's not accessible to like the everyday person, but was it like on a military base or somewhere like visible to the public, or was it like sort of out in the middle of nowhere, like out in nature, or on a military base or something?
Yeah, it was pretty much out in the middle of nowhere, and it like had like it was like a really tiny area that looked like it could be like a military thing, like a small like chain link fence, and like a small parking lot, like a shed or two. And but it looked like almost like there was nothing. There was like middle of nowhere, and there's just like this random like little like fenced off area because it had like a kind of like a ramp, and the profile of the land was such that like you really wouldn't see the ramp. You were on like a main road, and then you had to take a dirt road off of like the highway essentially, and then you would for a ways, and then you would get to like this area that I was talking about. And then once you finally were like right on top of in the fence, basically it's like the profile of the land was such that that's when you could see like this ramp down into, like, it looked very like abandoned up top, but once you went down the ramp it was like a really like you know well kept, almost like parking garage type looking type thing. It was like had just like a place for a lot of people to park vehicles. And then recessed into the opposite wall was essentially the elevator doors, and you usually had like a couple guys in military uniform, in army uniform, that were like guarding the entrance, to standing on the outside of that elevator, and then usually one on the inside of the elevator that was like that was operating it basically. So yeah.
Were you taken there often?
Yeah, I mean, when I was in Texas, I mean, I probably had been there at least like a dozen times, yeah, I mean, that was like, yeah, one thing I remember in this memory in particular is I was begging and trying so hard to like have Gates change his mind about throwing me away, is that like I was like trying to like basically like sexually pleasure him like in the elevator, and like the elevator operator was like getting off on it, like like, oh, you got like a well-trained pet there and stuff. And Gates was pretty much like, nope, she hasn't lived up to my like expectations and stuff. But it's like because I thought I was going to die, it was like the different parts that had loyalty to him were trying to like do the things in the past that had the parts, especially like dog parts and stuff, that knew how to like make him happy or make him smile or different shit like that, in an attempt to like make him change his mind essentially. So um But yeah, but I mean, there were other times that I had gone to that bunker where I was in like the bodyguard, you know, assassin type part, and she felt like the queen of the bunker. So when she was there and that she was like excited, she was like queen of the underworld, she was excited. Because a lot of times when I was in the bunker, especially for like blackmail situations or something where I would be in the dominatrix, that dominatrix type personality, child dominatrix, that it's like, I would, I would be on his arm as like, like you would see like a rich guy walking around with like a hot chick or something, like some arm candy, and that's like how he treated me. And like, I he was superior to most people that he encountered in the bunker. Not everyone, but most people, ranking wise. So he enjoyed belittling people and calling people out on stuff. And that part of me also enjoyed, like, that was something that made him happy. Was me, that part of me was like almost like a little version of him to where it's like I, as a child, was on his arm, allowed to, to dress down other people and their slaves that they might be there with, and different, make horrible like humorous remarks, or if I noticed something that wasn't done right protocol wise, to call him out on it, and he would, so it really depended on like the the part that was out when we were in the bunker, the relationship that we had to it. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. It's terrifying in every single way, especially, considering how many other places are just out in the middle of nowhere that, are access points for these types of things to occur, and people have no idea, and like you said, it's just so isolated that nobody would know if you were down there. You can't hear noises, you can't hear screams, you can't see who's coming in and out. It's just it's really terrifying to think that there's children being taken to these places, much less crime that adults are committing with, murder and, how you said there's rooms of people that they're torturing and taking their limbs off and, using them in these scenarios. And yeah, what are they doing with the rest of it? It's just, I mean, crime on crime on crime, right?
Yeah.
It's totally literally
This is
underground.
Yeah, and this is a spot that I've always speculated is maybe the same bunker or a connected one to the one
Dylan Groves.
Dylan Groves had talked about, with Uncle Sam's Snuff Factory. It's like similar location and just like very similar to like what, the look and activities that she experienced in that, but I mean, ultimately, like that's just a known thing. Like it was obviously originally like a maybe like an older like bunker. It had like the blackmail rooms I was in had a very like 70s vibe to them, basically, like as far as like the decor went and everything. But I it had, I mean, it's hard to describe to people how large, these facilities are, like how many levels there are, like how specialized each level is, with rooms designated for different things. That's the one I had talked about in the unicorn programming, like where there was a room I had visited many times that, it's hard to call it a room. It's more like a friggin' football stadium or something, I would assume, where it was like it was a large, falsely lit, like outdoor area, had an area that was like a pleasure garden, had like a fake running brook, had like all of this, some real and some fake, foliage. It was like, but it was massive. And it was a place that, I had undergone some programming, of different parts had undergone different, that setting had been used for different parts to undergo different types of programming, and, this, it's wild to describe to people like how, I don't know, like how elaborate, it's like you're picturing like stage sets and everything, that are large and well maintained and completely underground, like it's yeah, it's pretty wild. And I think enough people have like talked about their existence in all these different states that, I mean, there's a lot of people that speculate a lot of them are connected, to each other. So it's like the ability for underground transportation of people and resources is like, it's pretty it's pretty shocking, I think it's one of the things that probably is the hardest for a lot of people to like wrap their heads around, but many survivors have talked about, the same kind of facilities. So
Absolutely. Especially because again, like in entertainment and Hollywood, when we typically think of, say, an underground bunker, it usually looks very dungeony, grungy, dirty. There's not anything sophisticated. There might be like lanterns that have fire in them to light the way that people carry. It's really difficult to picture a football field underground that's maintained, that has a brook and that looks aesthetically pleasing and would maybe be, fun or appeasing to a child. Like it's really difficult to think about, and especially you think about like a real football field size activation that's on land, how much staff it takes to maintain that. You think about putting people underground and that there's actually people down there that are facilitating this and keeping it secret and like going to work there every day to, do these things.
Yeah,
It's
and they
just,
have a huge slave population to maintain it too, like that's a lot of like what I was, that part of me that enjoyed being down there was shown. It was almost like he was taking me through, this whole kingdom is yours, like Simba like type of thing, like where it's just like taking me
yes.
through all the different levels. So it was dual purpose, one to show me like all the horrors that could happen, but also to show how big and expansive and all these different things that it had, and to make that part of me, that hierarchy part of me, feel privileged, to be there and be part of all of that. So yeah, it's
Yeah, and
pretty
even with
wild.
that, you see the manipulation that goes into one of these scenarios where they put you in this horrific situation, like what you were just describing, being in that little tunnel thing, but then immediately after you're taken to another room and told that you're part of, this triage of goddesses and like this is who you are and praising you basically for like getting through that, It's like just the different levels of manipulation too, going from one scenario to the next
And then into like a sterile hospital ward, it's so like, jarring, and it's all in like one location, obviously different levels, but it's still, it's all the same bunker.
Yeah, but again, it's a really good representation of how you said kind of tying up and sharing how these different parts are made and what types of scenarios that they would go through in order to become a part, and what types of things that they're trained for, and it's just I mean just the elaborateness of it. Like I said, it's so difficult to just take into consideration, the psychopathy behind these people and how they look forward to doing this and like this is what these people are doing with their day.
Hmm.
Are these different events and like setting them up and facilitating them and hiring people to be there to help. It's just I mean, it's just beyond. But again, you see why they would want the loyalty. They put all that time just into that one event of however many that you have been through. Of course, they don't want you to leave. Like you've become an asset to them, not just from an operational standpoint, but the money and time that they've put into this and the amount of, conditioning and setting all of this up time after time after time, that the last thing that they want is to lose you,
Hmm.
so it really is it's a miracle that we get to learn from you, Carrie, and it is, it's amazing seeing you here today. It almost like leaves me speechless whenever I hear these stories. It's like seeing where you came from and where you are now, like what a night and day difference that you have created in your life through the healing that you now educate us on through all this learning, and your courage to continue your journey of progressing forward and finding these different positive ways to interact with a whole different life than what you grew up in, and to be able to now help other people get their own freedom back, and to find healthy ways to interact with the world, to use these different skill sets that you were conditioned to have to, benefit yourself and humanity. And that ultimately on the other side, like you can find happiness, you can find love, you can find freedom, you can find things that you love doing that feel fulfilling, that are different roles than what you were doing before whenever you were part of, the cult. So I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your courage. It's really amazing how you can be so clinical with things, but you're also so raw and unfiltered with how you talk about your testimony. And it was neat seeing those two different sides of you today interact with each other because usually it's kind of like one or the other we have. So I really appreciate you being willing to educate and then also, share with us a vulnerable real life situation that you were in to help us kind of see the big picture and to kind of tie it all together with what you taught us earlier. So thank you with all my heart, Carrie, for of course coming on and sharing and for being so vulnerable and raw with us. I know it's so hard to talk about this stuff, but people on the other side of the screen really, really appreciate it. It makes a difference. And I mean, you've changed and saved lives, and I hope you know that.
Thank you, Emma. I mean, all I can do is just thank you, too, because you're the one providing the platform for me to talk at all about this stuff and to feel, safe to do so. And, it's uh getting the feedback from you, but then from everyone, it's just it makes everything worth it, not just the time that we put into doing stuff like this or our channels or stuff, but also just like the massive amount of like time and pain and energy that's like gone into healing in general, that it's on a certain level it's felt like, it got to the point when I started advocating that it wasn't, the healing wasn't just for myself, that it was like it was for anyone else out there that needed some, you know, uh, light at the end of the tunnel, but also for all of the victims that I saw that like are would never be able to tell their story and everything. It's like it's felt it's felt transformative to me. So I'm just grateful that it's helped you and everyone else too, because um, I'm just grateful to you and this opportunity.
We're really grateful for you, Carrie, and I'm really excited to keep watching you blossom. I feel like every time you come on, you're blossoming more and more into figuring out your purpose and your way and what you can use these different skills for and these experiences, how you can turn all this darkness into something light, and turn it into something. Love how you said transformative. You're doing that every single day, and it's amazing. And I know it gives other people hope too on the other side of the screen who are feeling kind of that disparity that we were talking about earlier. And was there anything else that you wanted to talk about today?
No, just to encourage like everyone to just recognize that they're also, you know, if they stick with healing, they're also, if they're not already there, they're also going to get to the point, where they can recognize, their own worth and part, in this world, healing themselves and healing the world. I feel like that's really everyone's, like ultimate, reason for being here, maybe minus like the psychopaths. But, but especially for like survivors like that, it's like, like you're part of, the army for good. And if you're here and healing, then it kind of already means that you've won the war. You just need to stick around, a little bit longer.
Absolutely. And speaking of that, for people who aren't yet subscribed to Carrie's YouTube, I'm going to share it up on the screen. You guys should definitely, and I really, really highly encourage you guys to please go subscribe to her YouTube it's at Carrie Olaje, but if you type in Desert Dakini, a survivor's perspective is the full name of her channel. But if you just type in Desert Dakini, she's literally like the only one that comes up. Every time I type that in, it comes up right away. But you guys can type in Carrie Olaje, and I'm going to have that in the show notes. And did you want to talk about your page at all, Carrie? I know we talked about it a little bit earlier, but did you want to say anything else about your page and sort of, what's coming up or anything else about it that we didn't cover yet?
I mean, just I guess like more to come. I've been trying to figure out how to turn my videos into like short snippets, but that's not really my strong suit. This is like being like less wordy, so I've kind of abandoned that right now because I'm like it takes me like way too many takes. I'm never happy with it, trying to shorten things down into just a few minutes. So right now my only plans are really to just kind of like round out the Understand Dissociation series with a couple more focuses on persecutor parts like introjects and inanimate objects, and demons, essentially, just kind of having individual videos like specific to working with those parts. And then I'm actually going to be transitioning into a new series where I'm just focusing on specifically, deprogramming, so addressing ritualized abuse and manipulated dissociation, and really just, kind of like we talked about today, just starting to, try and make small, easily digestible, videos that just go over each of these, specific topics in a way that, is welcoming and maybe a little less triggering than my testimony, essentially, just to kind of give people some direction and some context when they're dealing with this stuff in their own lives.
And a lot of you ask, what can you do to help? And I know a lot of people are short on time or you have families. It is a struggle trying to juggle a lot, especially whenever you care about a cause so much. One of the easiest things that you guys can do is A, subscribe or follow them on social media, and B, share it on your share their pages on your social media. Watch Carrie's videos if you guys belong to Facebook groups, if you know survivors, if you guys know Telegram channels, or if you have an X account. Take her videos and just share them. Encourage people to go watch them. These are really, really informative videos. She also has some of her other episodes that she's done on this podcast, as well as Sean McCann's podcast, Waking the Dead. Those are really awesome episodes too. She covers a lot in those, and she has those on here too. So you guys can watch some of her other podcasts that she's done on other people's platforms. So I definitely encourage you guys to please support. It's such an easy and free way to support survivors, and it helps them tremendously whenever we have eyes on them, whenever we help feed the algorithm, likes, comments, shares. Those things really help this material become visible in a world of cover-ups and kind of agents that are working against this, that get popularized and profit off helping cover this up. So if you guys could go help carry out, that would mean the world to me and to her. And you guys would have a great resource to continue your learning and to learn more about dissociation, memory integration, and a lot of the different things that we talked today regarding systems, parts, and everything in between. So, Carrie, thank you again for coming on. It's an honor to have you on, and I can't wait till we do it again. And I really appreciate the time that you took with us today explaining all of this.
Thank you. Thank you again, Emma.
We love you so much. And for everybody listening, I'll have Carrie's information and mine in the show notes. Connect with us, share, comment. If you guys enjoyed this episode as well, take this episode and share it on your social media. It would mean the world to us. We couldn't do this without you guys. Your guys' support means the absolute world, and we are here because of you. Without you guys, we'd be just speaking into an empty black void. So I really appreciate all of you guys supporting Carrie and the rest of the warriors that come on and share their testimony and this information. So thank you guys so much for listening. God bless you all, and we will see you next time.